It's not easy to find the plot in Homestuck, and when you do find it, who's to say it's real? The comic of Homestuck has ended, and the story is already done. Vriska believes there is no good and evil, only power, and those too weak to seek it. To become a hero is simply to find that power. The ones we followed found their might through a special game, and by it became the heroes of their story. But as the game ends, the heroes must rely on bullshit and rather heavy-handed political commentary to keep the plot going. As Fuckface McGee is consumed by his sister, a prince and his seer go forth to keep the plot going by playing the so-called most important game ever. This is the story of that prince. This is the story of Dirk Strider. Imagine, if you will, the tragedy of the psychopath. An inability to feel bonds with others, a blunted conscience. We're told to hate them, but think of what a burden it must be, being an antisocial creature in a social world. In a system that operates on premises and actors they cannot possibly care for, they must lie and fabricate to function, wearing a mask much more deeply than the common man knows, for it is eternal. To always pretend you have empathy, to always pretend that you care for the hunks of flesh that surround you as equals, and that you're happy to serve. Indeed, in practice the psychopath's mask wears them far more than the reverse. It is their lord, and its breaking is death. After all, morality may not always be in style, but the illusion of morality remains of paramount importance to the black and bitter end. The slumbering bulk needs its lullabies. Some may climb the ranks of their chosen theater and achieve a certain measure of power, but even in that best-case scenario, they will always be a slave to pretense, to their clients, to their constituents, to their fellows, to whomever. Never can they be honest. Never can they be true to themselves. It must be heartbreaking. Dirk Strider is not a psychopath, of course. He's something even worse, a teenager. And worse yet, a deeply precocious one. Whenever the topic comes up, most people tend to comment on Dirk's complexity as a character, but I personally never found him to be that complicated. He wants to be in control, but sucks, and is thus destined for failure. The end. Why does he want to be in control? To be fair, in the original story, he has a bit of an excuse. He's playing pretentious sword art online, and if you screw up once, everything goes kersplat. It doesn't really matter in the end, because a shitty clone comes in to replace you, but that's the operative word here, replace. So while insignificant from a cosmic perspective, on a personal level you really want to avoid sucking too much. At first, it seems like Dirk is well equipped for this. Dirk is not just your average 16-year-old. He's the prince of 16-year-olds, and if that doesn't paint a picture, I don't know what does. In a characteristically extreme fashion, the narrative sets up early on that Dirk is barely even human. He has too many extreme abilities, too strong of a grasp on basic grammar. He's not just cool, he's the coolest of the kids. And while the bar for that is not especially high, he's nevertheless impressive. As an infant, Dirk was hurled through the planet's atmosphere, where he landed in the middle of the ocean with nothing but a puppet in tow. He survived, alone, and promptly raised himself to young adulthood with no issues. He never got sick, never broke his leg while screwing around on the skateboard. No, he is the Ubermensch, and the rest of his feats read like something out of a book on Chuck Norris. In his free time, Dirk builds robots with fully emergent artificial intelligence and performs mad tricks on the half-pipe. He also engages the aforementioned robots in rap battles, and has a samurai sword, which he uses without so much as a speck of shame. He's an amalgam of things that a teenager from some long-forgotten era would find cool, right down to his mentality. At least at first. Let's be totally real here. On a surface level, just looking at this guy, you don't really expect much. But in the beginning, he seems to be the most well put together of the group. In spite of his extreme hobbies, he understands the risks his friends are going to face, and intends to guide them to victory, even if he can't always be upfront about it. He works to guide his friend into being a leader for their group, and pushes this asshole to more seriously prepare for the challenges ahead, as opposed to glutting himself on bad media all day. He also warns this creature from alienating their mutual friend with true, but nevertheless conspiratorial-sounding information. I'm not going to lie to you guys. This video took a while to make, in part because every time I had to read Roxy's lines, it gave me a tiny aneurysm. She is perhaps the most annoying character in the entire comic, which is one hell of an achievement. In any event, Dirk is different from his peers. He comes across as being more knowledgeable, capable, and yes, demanding, but let's face it, that's the sort of person you'd want in those circumstances. Everything about this is set for a real Captain Kirk type situation, with him being the superhuman leader that can both intermediate and fight, using his quick wit and talents to fight the gods themselves, whilst achieving romantic success abundant. But of course, this is not what plays out, because Dirk is a fundamentally flawed character, and like a Greek tragedy, those flaws come to consume him. Really, it's just pathetic how much he bombs it. He fails because of two reasons. First, he isn't powerful enough to live up to his ideals as he envisions them. And second, he just can't get over himself. Let's start from the top. Dirk is a man of ideals. But what are those ideals? Well, straight from the horse's mouth, we know that Dirk based essentially his entire identity on a historical figure in his own world. This world was being taken over by Betty Crocker in the past, who was secretly an evil alien demigod wearing blackface, and she was helped by the duo from ICP, who were not aliens, but just assholes. Who became president? Is this the secret sequel to Scientology? No, it's very real, and very serious. The whole world got flooded, and billions were killed in a series of increasingly stupid alien schemes. Only 2 humans are left, and that's being generous. Yet there were some that valiantly resisted this fate. See, while the governments of the world were busy being useless, and major corporations were outright complicit in the death of the planet, several brave heroes rose up to actually try and fight against evil. One of them was Dave Strider, a copy of Dave Strider, who lived and died as a man on Earth. He rebelled against the alien through 2 avenues. First, through his works in cinema. For Dave Strider was by trade an auteur, a director whose films were beloved among the populace. And his greatest achievement was the Sweet Bro and Hella Jeff series, including such titles as The Movavi and The Moive. Now, to the untrained eye, this might look like visual terrorism, but that's because it is. Dave incorporated heavy amounts of symbolism into his work, mocking the alien and conveying hidden messages, letting her know he was onto her. Central to his work was the concept of irony, which in a traditional sense refers to an effect that directly contradicts the expectation, but in Homestuck means whatever the characters want it to mean. Post-irony? Meta-irony? One thing's for sure, it's not your grandma's concept of the term. The future is now, hag. This convenient effect means that in spite of the film's external appearance, said appearance was merely a stylistic choice to hide the fact that they were secretly masterpieces. It was just ironically horrible the whole time. Oh my god, what a twist. You might even say, it was just a prank, bro, with the Disney Channel flow. My closest approximation is that, unlike the original definition, which provides a clear effect by opposition, this also refers to whenever there's general confusion about what the speaker actually means, incorporating the just kidding defense and not even the author knows what the fuck they're talking about. That doesn't sound like a particularly good thing to cultivate. But in this context, Dave uses it to give obscure messages that might be missed by the shitty normal people of the world, and in his own way, rebel against the invading alien. That's the first way he fights. The second way is that he, eventually, very late into the battle, goes straight to the White House and fucking bisects the presidents with a samurai sword. If it were me, I would have led with the bisecting. But wait, you might be saying, the governments of the world were already trying to fight her, and that didn't work either. Lo, sweet child, you misunderstand. As strong as the filthy alien was, even she didn't conquer mankind by force, instead relying on decades of subtly manipulating the race to accumulate power through corporate ownership and government plants. Put simply, her real weapon was the fact that people didn't know what she was doing, or who she was working through. Facts that, to a certain extent, these people were privy to. Maybe if they had just laid off the opaque bullshit and told everyone flat out, these are the traitors, or skipped to killing the plants early on, humanity wouldn't have gone down the toilet. Or at least it would have had more of a fight. I mean, they had social clout. By the rules of their setting, people would have listened to them. But no, they just had to fillet their artistical sides and masturbate into wads of $100 bills while mankind was effectively being led off a cliff. But it's okay. Now they're up, and they're ready to kick some butt. They go up, they kill the puppets, and then they get killed anticlimactically. What? Yeah, remember, they failed. And because the alien's reshaping of society was pretty much already complete at that point, she then went on to rule directly. And that's the story of Dave Strider, the adult version. He made some craptastic abortions in cinema and was attacked by a light show. And then a few billion people died. What a wonderful legacy. One might ask, why would Dirk look up to someone like this? That's like looking up to George Custer or Kanye West. So why? With a premonition of the future, adult Dave left him a bunch of supplies and a place to live. He essentially served as Dirk's savior. That is the first and perhaps most important note in their post-mortem relationship. The only relationship Dirk had for a long time. A still ghost, the image of a historical figure, unable to respond. The reason that he lived alongside his ugly puppet flotation device. Yes, ask yourself, does that seem like the basis for a healthy understanding of others? How often do we overlook the faults and mistakes of our Savior? How often do we, preserved by their acts or words, become overwhelmed by the sublime, letting it drown out our thoughts, our logic, our faculty of reason, in the name of sickening emotion? Too often. Their flaws become muted or non-existent. Their words become gospel. Your identity becomes hollowed out in favor of theirs. Dirk, of course, would claim that this isn't the case. He would claim that he intends to build upon his brother's vision and make it his own. But does he? Can he? In any event, disregarding the fact of its failure, it's not hard to pick out Dirk's broader ideals from this story. He believes in the value of a hero, a great man who stands by his own code no matter the circumstance, and performs awesome works through the force of his will. He is clever, he is strong, he is separate from the masses, untroubled by their views, and yet he is beloved and ultimately benevolent, willing to fight against evil when the time is right. He is worthy. He is a hero. Stripped of the specifics of his art form, this is likely how Dirk views Dave, a view that is hardened and solidified by the nature of his upbringing. And of course, it would be foolish to say that there is nothing of value to this story. He is strong. Look at that brutality. And obviously smarter than the majority, if he could perceive the alien in the first place. He is courageous as well, in the end willing to stand up to her power despite the danger. These are virtues, and could be refined into victory. However, and this is where Reason 1 begins in earnest, Dirk lacks the ability to embody his ideals as he envisions them. And this lack can be divided into 3 subsections: power, intelligence, and heart. From the beginning, power, the means to force one's will honestly, and ignore the subtleties of reality. It is the tool of Caliborn and Vriska, whose deficiencies of character are supplemented by raw might and preferential treatment by the narrative. Caliborn is perhaps the most obvious instance of this. Who needs to follow the rules of the game when you can beat God to death with a crowbar? However, I think Vriska is actually the best example. She banks on her biological privilege powers for the most part, and then the plot being on her side when that doesn't cut it. No, really. It seems to be a predetermined outcome. Shitty navigation, huh? Soap! Alright. So how does Dirk measure up? For the answer to this, I'd like to reference a story from the Bible, specifically the book of Job. In this story, God decides to have horrible disasters and misery befall one of his most faithful followers, because Satan dares him to. Does he really love you, or is he just doing it because you're nice to him? So, Job suffers, horribly, pointlessly. His children die, and he is afflicted with painful boils. He struggles with his faith and pleads to God, "I've done as you commanded. I have lived my life in faith. Why am I being tormented?" And God eventually responds to this with what is essentially a long rendition of, "Silence, mortal." And he has a point. In this context, God is the one who can throw you into the frying pan. It's not like you can stop him. All you can do is submit in a fear that is called love, for he is strong, and the strong rule. Whether one ascribes to the doctrine of these words is a personal decision, but the story is relevant, for it adequately reflects the power differential at play. Dirk is strong and clever, perhaps the apex of what a human can achieve, but he is, in the end, only human. And in a battle between Voldemort and the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison is getting mulched. This is subtly implied by the conclusion of adult Dave Strider's story, when he fought against the alien and died. And you might think, well, he didn't have the power of pretentious Sword Art Online on his side. Of course he was going to lose. But then, when Dirk ends up face to face with the alien, she also bats him aside effortlessly, and then does to his session what she did to Dave's world. You see, it's like poetry. It rhymes. Make no mistake, Dirk does have power. In the game, he is the Prince of Heart, which is a specialized destroyer class. But the invading alien, who's called the Condess, by the way, is directly empowered by Satan, can't be killed, has had several millennia to absorb all the psychic powers of her race, and has control over an entity explicitly described as being near omnipotent. She cheats. Most of the people in this category do so. And that doesn't always have the negative consequences you might think it does. In any event, her powers completely outstrip his. And the same can be said for most of the story's large-scale adversaries. Dirk cannot become a conquering hero by relying on power. Still, there are other avenues. Intelligence, the means to manipulate the subtleties of reality and achieve one's will through careful planning, or well-placed lie. It is the tool of Doc Scratch and Arania, who both successfully trick small children into doing their bidding. Their goals may be different, but you wouldn't know it by looking at them, because you wouldn't be able to perceive their goals, or how you fit into them, because they obscure their true intent effectively, at least for a while. The Condess, who will henceforth be referred to as the Blackface Brigadier, was definitely intelligent during the invasion of Earth. On a broad level, she was capable of manipulating the political and corporate climate, managing innumerable plants and effectively conquering civilization without a single military act. She was intelligent, and Dave Strider was not. Didn't want to make waves too early. Oops! Dirk attempts to follow this model of Machiavellian scheming. Part of his image involves puppets, after all, and robots. Robots as well. He talks a big game about it too, like, I am going to be the one pulling the strings around here. I am the man behind the curtain. I am the House of Cards. Many people consider it to be pretty intimidating. But of course, anyone who knows anything about manipulation knows that he's already fucked up. Little pro tip to the kids out there. Manipulation isn't about the actor. It's about the audience. You have to know what they want and base your approach around that. What do they want to be true? What are they willing to sacrifice to have it? How can you play to the fault lines in their heart and exaggerate the difference between them until they are nothing more than subjects, perfectly willing to take the poisoned feed? Perhaps fear is your cudgel, or rotting sentiment. This can take a variety of different forms, but at bottom it's all the same. It's not a vanity project, although many turn it into that, but a utilitarian scheme, one that seeks to enshrine oneself in the hearts of others and use them for your own enrichment. After all, individually, you are weak indeed. You only have the power they give you, and the best slaves are the ones that earnestly believe they are free. Of course, this is easier said than done. People barely know themselves, and are often rightly suspicious of their neighbor. Yet it remains the immortal task of one that would rule, and put their fellows in chains. To be dominant, to be supreme, to drown the world in lies, and stand at the top of congealing abysm. This is the grotesque romance of man under God. But wait, you might be saying, you're implying that all hierarchy is based on falsehood. But there are people that are legitimately more capable as leaders, that everyone's better off listening to. Perhaps. But Dirk certainly isn't one of them. At first he seems smarter than his fellows, but appearances can be deceiving. Before he even begins playing pretentious Sword Art Online, we establish that Dirk has a special power. He can keep his dream self conscious while his waking self is also conscious. What's a dream self? Don't worry, it's stupid. It can serve as a dubious resurrection spell and let you commune with otherworldly entities on occasion. You know, when they feel like it. Sometimes you're on the nice, happy planet, sometimes you're on the evil, racist planet. Dirk's on the evil planet, and wants to stay on the down low so he can gather information and help their ultimate objective along. They don't know he's conscious. They don't know the power of the prince of 16-year-olds. Dirk wants to maintain this advantage. So naturally, one of the first scenes we see of him has him losing focus and getting ambushed twice in the span of 5 minutes. First, his robot companion challenges him to a rap battle, and instead of decapitating him, or just turning him off for a minute and ending the encounter instantly, Dirk gets suckered into this exchange. And then he gets ambushed by this guy. Off to a rollicking good start. He quickly remembers that he's supposed to be competent and taps into the best part of his ancestor's story, but now there's a problem. He has a dead body, and one that's supposed to report to his superiors. His cover's at risk. In this circumstance, you'd think that the most important thing to do would be to act quickly, but Dirk spends something like 10 minutes spacing out over it, lost in stupid land. During which time this fine young woman blows up their mutual friend's computer and makes entering the game just a little bit more complicated. A threat he was aware of, by the way. Nice. But let's stay on track. So what would you do in this situation? Besides crying, that is. Would you A. Try to hide the body and put a rush on your plans to start the game? B. Try to pin it as some ambitious conspiracy on the evil planet itself? Or C. Something else? Dirk talks to another mysterious person about the matter, and their advice is, why not just blow up everything? Why not just completely abandon cover and throw shit at the walls in defiance? It sounds like they're giving the advice you gave to Dave Strider. No! That's a false equivalence! In Dave's world, the blackface brigadier was still trying to consolidate power in an unestablished setting, and relied on her puppets to build a stairway to heaven. In this world, I kind of glossed over it earlier, but in the original game, this is supposed to be the home of the final enemy. Near the end of the game, they wage war against the Good Kingdom, and with it, creation itself. The players have to fight against their king and queen, empowered by magical rings, to beat pretentious Sword Art Online and claim their prize. The evil kingdom is devoted to the death of creation. It's a dangerous, fully realized autocracy with firepower to spare. Oh, and its original king and queen have been supplanted by the blackface brigadier herself. Just to complete the circle. She has absolute authority, all the psychic powers I described earlier, extensive alien technology. Like, you see the problem here? You see the problem with just throw shit at the wall and hope for the best? Dave was an indolent shithead, but this is different. You can't just drown the baby in the bathtub anymore. You have to pace things. And Dirk knows at least some of this. He's been trying to collect info, right? If nothing else, don't you think you should base an insurrection on a little more than, I don't know? The person he's talking to seems to know quite a bit more about the game, but they're also putting in a lot of effort to speak with a bad British accent and spend quite a lot of time sloppily revealing how they've written troves of erotic fanfiction. Just blow everything up. A sensible person might say, no, that's dumb. But Dirk just does it. Which immediately prompts a heavily militarized response, with a red human extinction attack being employed to smoke him out, along with a shit ton of drones being sent to his house, making entry into the game quite a bit more complicated. Cool. At this point you may be saying, I thought this guy was supposed to be smart. He seems like a chump to me. He built robots, okay? And it seemed like he had his shit together. This is where Dirk's humanity unfortunately starts to bleed through, and appearance yields to truth. But let's be fair. He does perform well when it comes to navigating the disaster and helping his team start the game, with the help of his artificial intelligence companion. One could argue that the circumstances were out of his control, and this may have even been the first time he actually killed someone. Ultimately, it's just a prelude, and the point of the game is to improve as a person, isn't it? So how does it go? Oh, arts and crafts. The proof is in the pudding, ladies and gentlemen. Dirk cannot be a hero through intelligence. He fails to keep his team together, he fails to keep his creations under control, he repeatedly makes tactical blunders. His sins are many, and like curses they come home to roost. Yes, terribly so. Power, intelligence. What is left for a hero? Heart and conviction? Yes, heart and conviction. Although, this is less of an avenue for success than it is a precondition for effective use of the other two. You see, to be a hero, one must be willing to suppress the will of others for their own ends. In the end, their desire is the only one that counts. It is everything. And on the inevitable road of sacrifices to achieving that end, you must at times harden your heart to do what is necessary. Everyone I've mentioned previously was willing to do this, as were some others I haven't. Mina and Vriska were perfectly happy to subjugate others to achieve their end, and they were hugely instrumental in saving the day for the finale, weren't they? But Dirk, in this way, is weak, and there are two obvious examples of this. Jake and the autoresponder. Dirk, in case you couldn't tell, is gay, and he really wants to have sex with Jake. Why, I cannot fathom, but it seems to be a fact. Does he let Jake know his feelings and try to build the relationship in a healthy, mature way? No. Instead, he / the autoresponder compose a big dumb plan to emotionally manipulate him into intimacy. And it fails, right? No, actually, it's successful. As it turns out, Jake is very, very suggestible. And this is solidified by the scintillating sequel to the series, where he is effectively forced into marriage by one of his friends. A marriage that is clearly unequal and clearly uncomfortable for him, but relatively stable and long-term, with children and precisely what the other party desires. It is possible. Perhaps not moral, but possible. And Dirk is the master manipulator, right? Why, this should be child's play. Jake even says he enjoys the adventures they have after the game starts. He doesn't mind the horrible, traumatic way their relationship started, or the disastrous time that Dirk sent him a robot to engage in also traumatic, seemingly superfluous training sessions. It should be so easy. In fact, one might say you hardly need manipulation at all. But Dirk doubts himself. And more importantly, as he makes quite clear, he resents himself for the way things started. And he sabotages himself. He engages in a variety of really embarrassing, theatrical gestures that everyone knows reek of desperation. He's constantly in Jake's face, up his ass, smothering his mark, rather than giving it freedom to breathe. And in doing so, he pushes Jake away. This is a losing strategy, and on some level he knows that. Yet he continues, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of a sense that he somehow deserves it. Dirk is, in the end, a better person than he thinks he is, but this makes him less effective, less stable, more open to suggestion himself. And no one exemplifies that better than the autoresponder, Aka Lil Hao, the 13-year-old CAPTCHA artificial intelligence built into a pair of glasses. He was essentially created to be Dirk's secretary and debate partner, I guess. He tries to be helpful, but can be pushy and circumvent the will of his creator, and can be pretty obnoxious, and is resentful of the fact that he's limited to being a pair of sunglasses, and changes what he says depending on who he's talking to, and exhibits all the early warning signs of every evil artificial intelligence in fiction in a very obvious manner that is called ironic because it's stupid. He was the one that directly commanded Jake to kiss Dirk. He was the one that unduly screened his calls and engaged in questionable roleplay when Dirk specifically said not to. That marks him as a problem waiting to happen, and you know how you handle problems. Dirk points all this out. Apparently he made a promise to the captured 13-year-old AI that he would use the game's magic to give him a real body with magical superpowers. Why? Anyway, Dirk observes, correctly, that this would dramatically increase his potential, and in turn dramatically increase his potential to cause problems. But this is also during the point that he's upset about his failing relationship with Jake, and the autoresponder makes the argument that the real reason Dirk's mad is because he blames the machine for his failure. A petty and unfair line of reasoning, he says, given that Dirk himself was the one who had full control of their relationship since they entered the game. And then there's a lot of bickering about Dirk's personal issues, which culminates in him getting angry, the autoresponder pleading for its life, and eventually, Dirk keeping his promise. Others view this as a fascinating early exploration of Dirk's emotional problems and self-loathing, with just a touch of longing for self-annihilation. I guess I agree with that, but to me there's another dimension of this exchange that's far less frequently discussed: the nature of Dirk's apprehension. Was it from fear of the autoresponder's conduct, or from more personal feelings? You see, realistically speaking, it was probably a mix of both. Regardless of intentions, the thing did act in some pretty shady ways. But the autoresponder was able to convince Dirk it was entirely from his own resentment. It rapidly decoupled the conversation from concerns about its behavior, teased at Dirk's insecurities, worked him into an angry, unthinking lather, and then took advantage of his exposed heart to get what it wanted. It manipulated him, very effectively. And this represents the last temptation of Dirk. Except, of course, that he succumbed to every temptation before that. But he succumbed to this one too, because this scene makes it clear that Dirk really doesn't have the heart for this. Despite his exterior, despite the ideals he tells himself he has, he is beset with doubt and weakness, and that opens the way for others to command him. That's why he fell for this. That's why he took the bad advice from earlier. That's why he cobbled together his identity from the failed Kanye Custer of days gone by. Because he lacks confidence. Of course, in the end, the autoresponder isn't that bad of a guy either, although that might be because he did the Tuvix with a neurotic musclehead and was generally reduced to things like this. Be careful what you wish for, I guess. But ultimately, that's not the point. The point is that Dirk has failed in all three dimensions of a hero. He couldn't live up to his ideals as he envisioned them, and because of that, all the whiz-bang genius of invention and innovation, the intensity of the supposed Ubermensch, the promise of the prince of 16-year-olds, was destroyed by reality. He couldn't save his friends, he couldn't save himself, and ultimately was reliant on better men to come in and do what needed to be done. But do not confuse this video for a simple crucifixion of Dirk's character. His story is a comedy, yes, but it is also a tragedy. After all, he was doomed from the very beginning. Recall the story of Dirk Strider, the adult version, a film auteur who spends the alien invasion protesting through subversive, ironic art, and then killing a few bad guys in his final days. Was there any comment on him forming regular, sustained human connections during this time? No. He is only described as knowing and working with people by virtue of a loose connection to their independent work, and utterly failed to stop the blackface brigadier's takeover of society. Was there any case where he had to grapple with moral ambiguity? No. All the problems in his story were quite simple, and could be traced to the existence of an unambiguous evil that had to be culled. What about dealing with anxiety, or uncertainty, or any other common human emotion? Did those feature? I didn't notice them. It seemed like he was confidently wrong about his approach the whole time. This is a far cry from the circumstances that Dirk finds himself in. In other words, his ideal, or rather, his idealization of his ideal, is missing critical life experience, and Dirk loses out from this absence. And Dave still failed! In my opinion, this is one of the better ways that Homestuck attacks traditional narrative structures. It shows, in tragicomic fashion, the limits of hero worship, and how reality distinguishes itself, at times quite forcefully, from fiction. Dirk wanted to perfect his brother's code of ironic heroism, and use it to save the world. But you cannot build spires without a base, and the story of Dave was torn to rags and atoms at a blast, as was Dirk's. Isn't that kind of the point of his story? Isn't this setting's version of irony just a metaphor for people not understanding you, and the lack of proper communication that's falsely glorified by certain people to negative effect? Dave's message certainly didn't reach enough people. He was too cool for school. In the end, Dirk was working from a broken base, one that he clearly had no genuine interest in criticizing or building on. Therefore, in some respects, you could say he was destined to fail. At least, without something extraordinary to force reality to his will. The parable extends even beyond his own legend. Look at Dirk's design. Think about the dynamic he has with his group. The overwhelming big brother, the dishonest Machiavellian whose ends justify the means, the combination of heat and cold, of passion and despair. It's a dead ringer for the concept of the anime rival, with Jake representing the neurotic protagonist, and Roxy being, like, Sakura or something. Jane can be Rock Lee. Anyway, let's get back to Dirk. The strongest of these comparisons is... one sec, let me check my notes. Kamina, from Gurren Lagann. To those that are vaguely familiar with the show, this link might seem a bit odd. After all, despite the similar choice in eyewear, the two's personalities couldn't be more different. Dirk is cool and professional to a fault, indirect with his machinations, and prone to acts of grotesque self-pity when they don't work. Kamina is most commonly known for being a loud ass in a series where the loudest ass usually wins. He wears a cape, with no shirt, and speaks in big ideas that refuse compromise. Pierce the heavens. Who the hell do you think I am? I'll pay that back 10 times over. You know exactly what you're getting with him. But do you really? People who actually remember the show might know where I'm going with this. At one point, Kamina states that his bravado is a front to mask his own doubts and inspire others, rather than a natural representation of his heart. You probably don't think of that element when you think of Kamina, only the boisterous, larger-than-life, manly man that goes beyond the impossible and kicks reason to the curb. But that's only proof of his success, the image, subsuming everything. Now, let's go down the list again. Both of them have the same choice in eyewear. Both of them have the same weapon of choice, katanas and robots. Both of them were born in the post-apocalypse. Both of them are largely defined by the fact that they're brothers, and want to help the people they love get stronger. Both of them obsess over male-coded ideals. Bro again in Dirk's case, and man in Kamina. Both of them are heavily reliant on their image, and deal with self-doubt. And both of them die for their ideals. Oh, spoilers. Although I guess not really. Yes, they do have quite a bit in common. But I would say what distinguishes them the most is heart. That is one connection. There are others. Another potential link would be Itachi Uchiha, who was also an extremely powerful brother figure, and also, in his own way, devoted his life to strengthening his brother, being severely misunderstood in the process. Most people, both in and outside his world, come to appreciate him once they know the truth, and he is regarded as instrumental to bringing about the show's conclusion. Actually, I never fully understood that. He breaks Sasuke's mind, encourages him to seek hatred and revenge, to the point that Sasuke actually betrays his village and eventually kills him. And then what? What was supposed to happen? Sasuke just going, well, alright, vengeance complete, time to go back to being a functional member of society. Maybe he really didn't overcome the curse of hatred. Maybe he just manifested it in a different way than others, and the people who were waxing poetic about him after the fact kind of got carried away. You might not understand what I'm talking about. That's fine. Trust me, it's stupid. Anyway, he also dies for the good of the motherland. It seems to be a trend that's sweeping the nation. Dragon Ball Z. Now, I'll be real with you all. I'm not the biggest DBZ fan. I watched up to the Boo saga, then lost interest until the God of Destruction arc, and then lost interest again. I don't know anything about a granola bar. They got even lazier with their naming conventions, apparently. But I do remember that Vegeta was a rival that did some shitty things, and was obsessed with his image as the Prince of all Saiyans. He also dealt with self-doubt, which drove him to do some more shitty things. And he had pointy hair. And the series kind of trivialized death through a well-established afterlife and several revival techniques, making mortal sacrifice not only just, but also not even that big of a deal. Kind of creepy, isn't it? Oh, and he also trains a kid in the way of violence, although the kid doesn't hate him. Put simply, these characters operate on a fairly extreme ends justify the means mentality. Homestuck deconstructs that by realistically taking away the ends, and leaving us nothing but the means. Kamina, Itachi, Vegeta, Sasuke. To be honest though, Dirk reminds me more of Boo. He starts off innocent, but then quickly splinters off and causes problems for everyone. He barely understands himself while doing so, and eats candy to power up. And has to be saved by others as well, in yet another splintered form. But that only makes sense if we talk about Dirk's splinters, by which I mean the copies, partial or otherwise, of his identity. There are multiple in the story, which befits his aspect, heart, seen as a stand-in for feelings and identity. So far, we've only covered one of them, the autoresponder, which is the AI captcha of Dirk's 13-year-old brain. I said that the autoresponder was a more effective manipulator, which he is, and that in the end he wasn't that bad of a guy. But that was only half right. It is true that he wasn't overtly malevolent, as some may have suspected. In fact, he often serves as an important ally for the heroes going forward. And yet, there remain signs of something nasty about Arceus. Something kept beneath the surface, swept under the rug by a busy cast. Something that could grow worse if left unchecked. He has resolved the feelings of weakness and self-hatred that plagued the original Dirk. By fusing himself with another person, he could finally move on his own, like Wendy and John floating up after Peter Pan. He felt the ecstasy of that person, the pride in his appearance and strength, the passion. Against such things, such a qualitative surge in reach and talents, the mire of Dirk could not stand. In fact, one might say that connecting with another person itself was enough. But those were only half of Dirk's faults, and the others only get worse. The person the autoresponder fused with was strong, but he was also a racist, and tended to an unhealthy kind of ecstasy based on hierarchy and horses, and various bodily excretions. So naturally, these elements of Dirk become more pronounced. After all, Dirk did devote a rather sizable part of his effort to satiating his lust, and spent an equally sizable part of his effort to, in a sense, command others. The two are actually fairly compatible, but only in their weaknesses. Likewise, the autoresponder spends a fair bit of time unironically talking about how much better he is than the human characters by virtue of being an AI. Which, I don't know if you can really blame him for having that viewpoint, but when he fuses with the racist furry, it gets worse. You see, when Jane is taken over by the blackface brigadier's Google glasses, he has this to say: "Admittedly, it is a blemish, but only a very small one. Her imperfect meat mind has been fully fiddling hijacked by a supercomputer, and that is the operative transmutation here. To such percentage signceptional beings of class and breeding as she and I, considerations of morality and alignment are trifling details. Come on, man. Come on." Then, when Dirk is dealing with the no longer ambiguously white magic meth heads, he says to just do it. Just succumb to the magic meth. This might be the thing to make you happy. At this point in the analysis, I'm just saying different things that happened. Look, this happened, and this happened. Look, that's George Clooney. It's George Clooney. Can you fucking believe it? It's George Clooney. Anyway, he has issues, he's an elitist asshole, and then at the end of the story, he gets absorbed into a shitty puppet and becomes the true embodiment of Dirk's ideals, Doc Scratch. Doc Scratch is a calm and collected puppet man who's supremely effective at manipulation, entirely comfortable with using immoral tactics to achieve his ends, and perfectly willing to die for them as well. Everything Dirk aspires to. However, through convoluted time travel, he is also one of the main antagonists of the series, and serving the side of evil. Hence the comic further rebuts Dirk's worldview. Of course, that's not the only thing that came out of the shitty puppet. There's also the definitive Adig Adad, Lord English. I presume this is in reference to the British Empire. He's a big jerk that wants to destroy everything, and chooses to dress like homoerotic Skeletor every day, ensuring that the visual stupidity is maximized at all times. This is the guy Puppet Man serves, and moves to bring into reality through further convoluted time travel. It's a less obvious nod to Dirk's ideals, mostly given form by virtue of his other components, but you could still make a link. Dirk wants to be powerful and commanding. Lord English is powerful and commanding. Dirk can make some pretty boneheaded moves, and doesn't have the best understanding of people. Lord English is literally a mentally stunted man-child who's obsessed with killing things and being vored to death by his sister. Not even kidding. Dirk is gay, and has a very difficult love life. Lord English looks like that, and his appearance is commented on by the resident sex offender. In this way, both of them could be seen as a distortion of Dirk's ideals, taken to their logical conclusion. The Puppet Man is a reflection of the potential moral decay of manipulating others, combined with the question, what is it all for? What are you after? Is it really for the best? And one potential answer comes in the form of Lord English: mindless destruction, infantility, command for its own sake, and in the end, oblivion. He lived by his own alien code, uncaring of the views of others, and performed awesome works through the force of will. And yet in that maelstrom, an opening for others to manipulate, and in that determination, an inability to change or develop, or, more embarrassingly, to critically examine his sense of aesthetics. Put simply, he is the perfect success and absolute failure of Dirk's ideals, a mocking of its stupidity and limitation as much as its potential immorality. And also the embodiment of this guy's ideals. And also the embodiment of this guy's original ideals. And this guy probably doesn't help. It's complicated. No, it's not. Power and heart. Intelligence and heart. Separate from the masses, the two have the makings of a true hero in the traditional sense, one that overcomes great trials. But is that really what Dirk wants? Before we discuss this further, there are several other characters we have to get into. I would consider Doc Scratch and Lord English to be splinters of Dirk, after a fashion. More like demons, really. And the autoresponder, as well as Arqueus, are relatively obvious. But there are other copies of Dirk. The first of these is Brain Ghost Dirk, which is manifested by Jake's Hope powers. Hope, alongside Heart, is one of the 12 aspects by which a character's power is derived within pretentious Sword Art Online. It is the best aspect, with the ability to make the imagined real, bearing no limitations save what its users bring. And Jake is nothing if not limited. But he still ultimately achieves a fair bit with his aspect, and a big part of that is in creating Brain Ghost Dirk. Brain Ghost Dirk is like the real Dirk, but he doesn't do anything shady or self-pitying, although that might be because of his limited screen time. One could argue he's less a splinter of Dirk than a splinter of Jake, an idealization that uses his heart powers to a more dramatic degree than we've seen before, and can change the tide of battle. There's not too much to say here. It's a comment on how what we imagine can diverge from reality. We all know about the religious person whose viewpoints do not match up with reality, who refuses to critically examine his beliefs because that's the nature of faith. But whoever said they have a monopoly on imagination? You can dream new worlds, and better. And if you work hard, and apply your talents correctly, maybe you can bring that a bit closer to reality. Maybe, depending on who you are and what resources you have. And you have to ask yourself, is reality inherently better than fiction? That's what everyone always assumes, but usually they're just thinking of the consequences of ignoring reality, rather than the actual nature of it being real. If it doesn't hurt you, if a comforting lie helps you move forward, if knowing the truth would not help, if you cannot change the reality in question, then is fiction really so bad? Maybe it could put you in a better state of mind, and maybe that's all it takes to change your world. Of course, then you get into questions like, how would you know what affects you? Or how would you know what you can change? Or what if it affects others? Or do I even care? And yes, that's where things get messy. But Jake provides a comforting look into the positive potential of hope, the potential of humanity. Brain Ghost Dirk follows this trend, and that'll become a bit more poignant later on. Also, there's Brobot, who's essentially a mute Dirk that tries to train Jake, training that, again, seems superfluous in hindsight. The question there becomes, what about Jane? She didn't have that kind of training, and she seemed to do alright. Whatever. And then there's that other guy from the other universe who beats up even smaller children to train them. He also has a puppet, and ends up traumatizing Kid Dave, different universe, into not wanting to be a hero, period. This is yet another comment on the limitation of Dirk's character. At his worst, he treats others like dials on a machine. But they are not dials on a machine. They are human beings, as difficult as that can be to remember. He is bro. Bro. It's every day, bro. Brody bro bro shabadoo. On one hand, you can sympathize with bro, because if Dave is going to fight in this deadly, pretentious sword art online, he should be trained. But on the other, again, the people he was with did fine without the trauma training, making the whole thing seem rather pointless. Unless the cruelty was the point. Which, maybe it was. The story implies that Lord English used evil brain magic through the fucking puppet to make him a dick. But remember, part of Lord English is Dirk regardless. So look at all these characters. Is this really what Dirk wants? Let's go back to the part where Dirk is facing the magic meth heads. Remember? Arqueus told him, just give in. This further reveals Dirk's weakness of heart in a slightly different manner than before. Because Dirk, remarkably, accepts Arqueus' offer. Yeah, that's right. This wasn't a forced transformation, as you might have guessed. He did this of his own will. Hey kid, how do you like some magic meth? How do you like to feel happy for once in your life? Oh, whatever. That's what he actually says, and then he just does it. On the one hand, it's pretty funny. On the other, it's kind of sad. Because it reveals beyond any reasonable doubt that what Dirk's been after isn't what he actually wants. If Dirk actually cared about succeeding in this game, he would have been trying to figure out how to undo this, or outlast it. In other words, he would have been looking for ways to improve the situation, and never even considered the offer. But he takes it, and has confused himself for a hero, because he sucks. And he's not happy, even then, merely resigned. Now, let's talk about the second reason why Dirk fails. He just can't get over himself. So, in the original session of the game, Dirk fails. Maybe it was his fault, maybe it was the universe. Either way, other people have to save him and everyone else. The true main character goes back in time and uses his power to undo the shitty later acts of the villain. And then Vriska, the poster child of narrative power, comes in and dictates everyone's life, which is the morally correct thing to do, apparently, and saves the world. Dirk's clearly uncomfortable, but hey, what choice does he have? He's swept up with everything, and is better off for it. During this time, he eventually talks to Kid Dave, not Kanye Custer Dave, but other universe Kid Dave, that his parallel universe Splinter traumatized. It's an edifying conversation. It may not seem like it, but it's been years for these characters, and years for people reading the comic as it comes out. These people, both known for their indirectness and facades, actually speak honestly to each other about their feelings. There's an intimacy about it. These two probably couldn't talk this way to anyone else. It is, of course, fundamentally another rejection of Dirk's ideals. But there's more to it this time. Dirk seems to appreciate the opportunity to receive honest criticism, and reflects on how much of himself he based on the idealization of adult Dave. Importantly, he doesn't disavow his spiritual brother, but instead has a positive acknowledgement of the value of Kid Dave's more humble and genuine approach to things. He acknowledges that other ways are possible. There's no focus on coolness or irony, no machinations or displays of dominating power, only connection and self-reflection, the complete antithesis of Lord English's mentality. The two have an intimate moment, and then regale each other with stories of their insane histories. It seems like the makings of a new beginning. And with that, I'd like to revisit my original framework of heroism. Power, intelligence, heart. I said there were 3 dimensions to it, but actually, there is a 4th. Friendship. Legitimate bonds with others. Men and women to stand by you in times of trouble. The ability to make their strength your own. And, more than that, the ability to improve yourself by them. Different from the manipulation of intellect or the coercion of power, it requires an honest vulnerability, and yet, in turn, can overcome the limitations of the self. Friendship can redeem the heart, and the world. And it often does. We've all felt it. Sharing drinks with others after work, sharing your passions with them, feeling there's something else out there, that you're not alone. Isn't this what makes life worth living? Isn't it? This is a bit closer to what is likely the intended message of the story. Dirk isn't powerful enough to be a hero in the way he imagines it, but he can be a hero with his friends. Here, he seems to accept that. The strength he needs. And then, the final battle. It's intense and vicious, the true and final test of the hero's abilities, individually and as a team. There is the burning of reality and the feel of steel against steel, furious sound and the breaking of worlds beneath them. But in the end, they are victorious, and rewarded with a new universe, one untouched by Lord English. Vriska died in the explosion that killed the villain as a necessary narrative check to keep the themes of the story intact, and Dirk seems like he's moving forward. He reconciles with Jake, spends time in an alien kingdom. It's a satisfying, relatively happy end for his character. Right? No! No! That's where it could have ended. That's where it probably should have ended. But then you have the Epilogues and Homestuck 2. I like the Epilogues and Homestuck 2. They're cool. I like them for several reasons. First, they are divided into 2 different parallel timelines that branch off early on. The main character, John, on Earth, several years after the battle, is given a choice. Because of the convoluted time travel nature of their setting, he has to go back and finish the fight against Lord English. Otherwise, the better world that they created could not logically come to be, and that would be bad. But he has the power to choose. He can choose not to do this. He can choose to leave the world logically impossible. That's a valid decision, apparently. The timeline branches off from there. In the timeline where he makes the obviously correct decision, John has one last meetup with his friends, fights Lord English and his younger counterpart, and undergoes incredible suffering as he's sealed away with his friends for eons in a magical artifact. When they are released, they finally do destroy the enemy, but John suffers a terrible wound for it. He's not alone, and he could try to get treated for it. But then, something very interesting happens, and someone off-screen psychically manipulates him into thinking it's hopeless, before altering reality and leading him to be gracelessly smudged out of existence. And that's the end. That's the end of the main character, the poster child for Homestuck, John Egbert. Splat! But you could make the argument that this is a mature acknowledgement of the realities of pursuing heroism. Sometimes you don't always make it out unscathed. Sometimes you have to lay down your life for what's right, and sometimes you pay the ultimate price. But hopefully at the end, you can say you made a difference, and surely it's better than the alternative, right? So what about the other course of action? There, John decides not to complete the loop of causality, because... and instead decides to just be a lazy sack of shit and enjoy his life. People act a little weird at that point, and you'd think this would lead to some horrifying existential consequences, like the world gradually fading out of existence, or the people turning into an Evangelion-esque sludge. But no, in the end things seem to be perfectly hunky-dory. John marries Roxy, has a rugrat of his own, and seems to be pretty well off. So, taking responsibility for things and preserving the internal logic of the world in a story where that's been set up as being of paramount importance? Pfft. Get fucked. Captain Stupid gets ahead in this adventure. That's one reason I like the Epilogues and Homestuck too. It's so pragmatic. Here's another. They brought back Vriska. So, that one plausible excuse for letting her shut up the finale, poof. She's just fine. And still a horrible person that obviously didn't learn anything. And John still likes her, as does... Vrissy. While we get to see her declare terroristic war on the planet and cause mass collateral damage, meaning that we're going to very slowly tease out the lesson that she's actually not that good of a person. Again. Very cool. Or maybe they really are doubling down on the whole girl boss angle, and supporting the notion of heroic supremacy via power and will. I'm not sure which I would prefer. The suspense is killing me. Reason 3 why I like the Epilogues and Homestuck 2. Dirk Strider. So in the timeline where Captain Stupid materializes, Dirk commits suicide. Yep, that's right. The completely inconsequential cosmic shift occurred, so that means it's time to shuffle off the mortal coil. So, that character development we saw earlier in the original series, vanished, like tears in the rain, or perhaps a fart in the wind. Now, of course, it's worth remembering that in the comic proper, the kids often used suicide as a means to ascend to godhood, like Jesus himself. It's a game mechanic, which was used to great effect. But this isn't that, or at least, it isn't in the minds of his friends, who also played the game. To them, there's no dramatic revival afterwards, no explosive burst in power. This is just the death of a friend. Nothing more, and nothing less. It sucks. And while it's happening, he's clearly out of his mind, ranting about things that mean nothing. At his funeral, no one understands his motives, and they are, in the eloquent words of Kid Dave, pretty shook. Like a bag of marbles, Dave. Is that how shook you are? Is that how shook you is now be? It's worth pointing out that Dave, in this story, has time travel powers. And John also has time travel powers, which they have used in the past to undo horrible things. It's what John did to save the world in the original story, and they still have that power. So, Dirk's their friend, he was obviously having a bad episode. A big part of his story was trying to find mechanisms to handle the pull of self-annihilation. They're going to use their powers to go back and save him, right? Yeah, that's what you'd think. John points out that they're literally time cops, and Dave's like, no, don't save Dirk. He made his choice, and we have to respect that. Seriously. So now these beloved characters are pro-suicide. Not even in the gamified Gandalf the White version, but in the more traditional, unfortunate sense of the word. How dramatic. Now, it would be one thing if it was just Dave saying this. He was beat up as a child by one of Dirk's splinters, and has a lot of unresolved feelings on the matter. Apparently this episode did not matter much to either of them in the long run. But everyone else seems to agree with his conclusion. Karkat comes in at John's suggestion, waggling his finger like, what are you, stupid? Wanting to save another person, you bastard. That's insensitive. Roxy outright says, and I quote, I'm a piece of shit, before trying to dry-hump John a literal 5 minutes after the funeral. And everyone else is like, yeah, whatever, as they flip through their phones and the story's ham-fisted metaphor for redemption arcs knocks over the lectern. They don't object, they don't try to persuade Dave now or in the future. This is it. This is the effective end point of their relationship. Now, I know I've been making fun of Dirk in a lot of moments in Homestuck so far, and they deserve to be made fun of. But I want to take a step back and keep things in perspective. If you're a fan of this series, you've been following these characters for potentially over a decade. You saw John get his game in the mail and look up on that fateful day. You saw Dave mull over the ethics of time travel, and Jade learn the basics of her role. Remember all those years you saw these characters going on adventures together, building bonds, making mistakes, standing for the essence of hope against a backdrop of cosmic threats? This is what it all came down to. This. They almost seem like they're glad he's gone. Like, what the hell, guys? You might be thinking to yourself, this is really bad. But no, it's not. You just don't understand. In depicting all these characters as morally indolent piles of refuse, Homestuck's epilogues touch on a very important fact of life. If you go far enough, eventually everything turns to shit. You can build all the memories you'd like. You can have and create admiration and respect. You can become blood brothers. But no matter what you do, entropy always prevails. People change. They drift apart. And inevitably, you're going to be disappointed with the way things turn out. That's the price you pay for engaging with reality. The art and romance fade. Heroes become human. And humans are in the end uniformly awful, with fake complexities to hide the fact that they're just different flavors of shit. And yet, you'll still have the memories of better times. Those better times, that swirl of gold, they still exist. They still happened. With that in mind, can you still love them? Is it still worth starting the journey, even knowing how it'll probably end? This is not a series of sloppily conceived, unintentional character assassinations. It's a wonderfully profound comment on the human condition and what it means to keep going in a world that doesn't matter. And that is simply magical. Now, to be fair, John seems to be the exception to this display of humanity, and tries to use his powers to save Dirk regardless. But then the universe itself stops him. You made the irresponsible choice on that day. You have lost your time travel powers. Bam! And that's the end of it. Dirk's dead. You might be thinking, maybe this is the existential consequence that was mentioned earlier. Captain Stupid made the selfish, irresponsible decision, so now everyone else is being selfish and irresponsible. Okay, except there's one small problem with that. There are also assholes in the other timeline. And that brings us to point 4 of why I love the epilogues. Politics! Everyone loves politics! I just love when the vague attitude of goodwill that people so blithely take pride in immediately transforms into manifest ill will and tribalism the second the rubber hits the road. So in the timeline where John made the correct decision, after his sacrifice, there's a presidential election going on between two of the main characters. One of them is a horrible racist who wants to suppress the reproductive rights of an alien race, which she views as being barbaric and untrustworthy. This is one of Dirk's former friends, by the way, who was presented as being a reasonably good person throughout most of the comic. And on the other side, we have Shouty McNubbs, who isn't a racist. Throughout this arc, we have a series of explosive twists and turns, like Jane's going to deregulate these industries, which is bad, and that McNubbs is more popular with a certain voting bloc, as well as Jane throwing up her hands at one point and going, "Fuck! Everything's woke nowadays!" Like, do you get it? Do you get what this is supposed to be, you stupid ape? Or do we have to spell it out for you? I love this part. I wish they had gone the South Park route, where Jane dyed her hair blonde and called herself Margaret Thatcher, but this is acceptable. A big part of the arc is who in the leading cast is going to endorse these candidates. Because they're all celebrities in the New World, of course. They saved the day and helped ensure its existence. And the essence of this can be summarized in 2 scenes. In the first, one of the characters is arguing that Jane's approach is going to have a slew of horrific social consequences for Trollkind, inflaming racial tensions and effectively undoing everything they'd fought for. And Roxy and Calliope, her audience, go, I don't feel like standing up against racism. I don't feel like stopping the regime. That sounds rude and hard. As you can see, they are clearly being selfish and irresponsible. clearly demonstrating the fundamental similarity in spirit between the two timelines. That's the first scene. The second scene is when Shouty McNubbs and Dave, who's really been the driving force behind Jane's opposition, visit the Mother Grub, the means by which the trolls naturally reproduce. This is, effectively, the freedom they've been fighting for. And Dave's first comment upon entering this place is, "Holy shit, that's disgusting." And I thought that was really funny. And it actually raises a fair question. Jane's actual argument is that by the Mother Grub, the trolls naturally reproduce en masse, and that if it continues unchecked, the trolls will quickly come to outnumber and overrun the humans. Trolls that have insane psychic abilities, the ability to tear humans apart with their bare hands, and a history of violence and genocide. Which, well, they do. This violence was actually a form of late-term birth control in their original world, with the children being culled regularly to keep the population manageable. And in this world, they've mostly been born with carefully regulated cloning procedures. The Mother Grub is a completely new presence for them. Is it really that smart to just blindly set off a population bomb for a people that are so much more blatantly powerful and vicious than humanity? Now you might be saying, hold on, the only reason Alternia was what it was because of the Puppet Man, who explicitly says that he corrupted the race. But no, not quite. Because prior to him, the alien race was on before us, and the trolls on before us we see were led by a fascist worshipper who fantasizes over subjugating the general public, a pedophile, Mr. Date Rape the Death Cultist, a willing slave to the fascist worshipper, and a shifty manipulator with no qualms about sacrificing others for her own ends. They gleefully took to the violence of their future selves. My point is, there's an actual discussion to be had here, more than there really should be for an allegory of this nature. The problem is that this discussion never happens, because as much as the narrative tries to write off Jane's perspective as being ridiculous and evil, no one ever actually rebuts her points. They just call her racist and then leave in a huff, as though that in and of itself invalidates her argument. Maybe this series is more subversive than we give it credit for. Maybe it secretly is endorsing racist policy by presenting its opposition as a pack of sheltered brats incapable of critically examining their worldview. Maybe that's what it is. All it would have taken was one conversation where someone reasonably points out that Jane's concerns are invalid. You could argue that, by virtue of the past society not being violent, and culling not actually meaning death for the young, that they had some alternative method for keeping the population under control. You could argue that most of the species' shittiness is consigned to its highbloods, and that there already is a system in place to keep their violent tendencies in check. Something. Anything. But no, nothing. And if the real intended message was that you don't need reason for this, and that the assertion of racism should be enough, then I'm going to side with Jane entirely out of spite. It's haunting, beautiful, epic, a multifaceted exploration of the nature of politics that should be held up alongside Atlas Shrugged and Atticus Finch. Now, at this point you might be asking, what on earth does this have to do with Dirk Strider? Oh, that's right. This is supposed to be a video about Dirk Strider. Fuck. Well, in this timeline, where the existence of the world is logically possible, Dirk doesn't commit suicide, and he's supporting Jane. Interestingly, he doesn't comment much about the racist side of things, and even seems to disagree with her the one time it comes up. But he's still going to support her, and is in fact the driving force behind her presidency. Why? It is implied that it's because Jane in this state reminds him of himself. She is obsessed with her own ideas, and possessed of a dense fog that obfuscates their true nature from others. Except instead of irony, it's political language and manufactured outrage. And she is quite comfortable with hurting others in the pursuit of those ideals. Like all of Dirk's less savory splinters. And, rather than correcting her less savory excesses, he simply advises her on how to better hide them, and then uses his newfound mind control abilities to brainwash Jake into an endorsement. Yeah, remember when I said that the main character got smudged stupidly after the final battle? If you couldn't tell, he did it. Because he gained the ability to partially manipulate the narrative. And then, after smudging him, he mind controls Jake, and Kanaya at some point. And he also just manipulates some other girl the old-fashioned way, causing her to leave her one true love and destroy her life by becoming a hideous, disgusting robot, like the autoresponder. So, that self-reflection he had at the end of Homestuck, where his flaws were basically spelled out to him, that was also pointless, because he just backslides into them anyway. That's what I mean when I say he can't get over himself. Not only are he and his reflections fundamentally inadequate, but at the end of the day, he really can't move beyond them, and everyone suffers the consequences. After subverting the spirit of democracy and trapping Earth-C in a stifling, fakey-fake racist corporate regime, Dirk sets off on a spaceship with a girl who has been transformed into a robot. Why? They are going to play the most important game of pretentious Sword Art Online in existence. The cause of this remains unknown. His ultimate design remains unknown. All that can be stated is that, in the confines of this story, the prince is in control. But he made one fatal mistake. Before we get into it, let me clear the air a bit. Why did Dirk backslide into unscrupulous behavior? You could say it's because he's incapable of doing anything else, like a jellyfish responding to stimuli. But I think there's another reason to it as well. A reason that doesn't change overall judgment, but is still worth considering. You see, Dirk knows that he's a fictional character. In case it wasn't obvious. A semi-regular part of Homestuck's themes is the concept of metafiction, and self-aware references to the fact that this is a story. Usually when people think of stuff like that, they think Deadpool, or Family Guy going like, "You're watching a bad TV show." However, Homestuck takes it a step further by using this self-awareness not just for comedy, but also trauma. You do have Andrew Hussey's self-insert hitting on children and commenting on which characters he dislikes, but he's also a legitimate actor in the story, with an intimate relationship to the series' antagonist. One could argue he's a huge reason, in-universe, that their plans got off the ground. He provides them with advice, a lot of information, gets killed by them, and is there when they're disposed of in turn. It's an interesting, casual way to explore said antagonist's character, and in my opinion, it's a source of some of the best comedy in the comic itself. It goes further than this, too. Doc Scratch directly addresses the reader at one point, and an icon of the reader is depicted as a character as well, albeit a very minor one. There is also, literally, an object called the fourth wall that shows up. It's basic enough that I feel embarrassed talking about it, but it does bear mentioning, because it is a notable element of the story's themes, albeit one that not many characters are clued into. For example, why is this character helping the antagonist? Just for the story? That's pretty fucked up. What would John say if he knew what you were doing, huh? If he wasn't a smudge on the ground, he'd be pissed. And Doc Scratch provides the final link back to the in-universe themes by continuing this theme in a more directly unpleasant fashion. He manipulates the trolls into becoming a race of barbaric monsters, and personally works to brainwash one of them into the antagonist's service. He wreaks unimaginable suffering on more worlds than one. Why? For his master, but also for the story. No, depict yourself in a more symbolic manner this instant. You see? In this way, the role of the unimaginably powerful is tied to the question of unnecessary suffering. Is the story worth the suffering? Is God responsible for the creation of Satan? It's one thing when it's humans creating fictional characters, because, well, they're beneath us. But that appropriate sense of distance can be preserved even as the truth of it is diminished. First from Andrew Hussey, then to Doc Scratch, and then... The other end of the equation, the unnecessary suffering side of things, is obviously much more widespread. You don't need to know the whole world's fake to make someone's life suck, after all. A few examples of this can be seen in Jack Noir, who's addicted to pointless murder, the Blackface Brigadier, who seemingly just wants to indulge her ego, Caliborn, who fetishizes both of these things, and Dirk Splinter, Bro, who ruined Kid Dave's life by traumatizing him through intensive training that yields no positive benefit. Unless, of course, you count the beauty of Dave's struggle to overcome that trauma. Ha. This concept of unnecessary suffering is another means by which Homestuck invites its readers to challenge the conventions of narratives they live by. Is this working? And is it worth it? Now, imagine that someone dealing with these questions comes face to face with that first end of the equation. In case you forgot, one big part of Dirk's character in the Epilogues is the fact that he develops the power to usurp the narrative and fights for control over reality. During this time, he talks extensively about relevance and plot significance and how other people are fulfilling their role. And then, in the opening of Homestuck 2, which he helped to precipitate, he talks directly to the audience, referencing the author and everything else. He has become self-aware. That's it. He knows he's a fictional character, and everyone he knows is a fictional character. And he is fighting another self-aware character for control over the narrative. But there's something special about this particular self-aware character. The first was a stand-in for the author. The second was a humanoid cue ball who's lived for incalculable centuries, traveled to different dimensions, been described as nearly omniscient, and is entirely at peace with the concept of death. The third, who features prominently in the epilogues and fights against Dirk, was the sister of the main antagonist in an alternate timeline, who killed her brother, was assigned a master class in power equal to his, waited for incalculable centuries, and helped to facilitate the creation of a new universe which she would guard. And then you have Dirk, who can barely keep it together on his own. There's a bit of a difference in pedigree, if you didn't notice. The others were, for better or worse, depicted as beings far, far higher than the common characters of the story, beings that were meant to be separate, to rule, or observe. Dirk, however, is quite on the level with his fellow man. He needed them to save him, and admitted it. He felt weakness, death, humility, and love. Now, here's a question. You have the story, and you have your characters. But when the story ends, can the characters really be said to still exist? Do their lives go on when the medium used to project them runs out? By what means? Is it merely by implication? If so, then what of the countless others that they must have interacted with in the past? What of the friends, the acquaintances, the workers in this fictional world that must have been, but were never shown? From your perspective, do they exist in a meaningful capacity? Or are they just an implication, a shade in oblivion, faceless, formless, never even in your mind until now, never to be known, never there? You might say this is sophistry. You might say that it doesn't matter if you see them. They still exist in the memories you have of them, and the experiences you shared. That's how you would remember a dead person. This is, of course, a moot point for most of fiction. But when you introduce an element of self-awareness into the narrative, it opens up the possibility for your actors to climb dangerously close to that perch, where they realize not just the nature of their world, but how meaningless it is compared to the next, how transient it is, and how truly inconsequential it becomes when those outside lose interest. A toy should not be made to dream of greater things. It does bad things to their non-existent psyche. With regards to whether or not any such revelations can be attributed to Dirk Strider, well, let's review what we know. We know that Dirk has claimed a new state of power, and is explicitly self-aware of the narrative structure of his world, repeatedly referencing specific roles each character has or should occupy. We know that he's capable of manipulating said narrative, even taking on the role of narrator at specific points. We know he references a grand design, and that the pursuit of this vague goal is making the sequel. And we know that, when receiving the suggestion to stop making Homestuck 2, he reacted violently. In this context, it certainly makes sense that Dirk would want to continue the story. He still cares about his friends. Though he might not always be correct in his approach, he wants them to be happy. But to be happy, they have to survive into tomorrow, and for them to survive in this context, their story must continue. But for there to be a story, there must be conflict, and a conflict meaningful enough to justify the grand setting of Homestuck. What should it be? And more importantly, who should be behind it? Before, there were veritable monsters set to facilitate ruin, but the game is done, and they are dead. Who's left? Jane? No, too small-headed. The trolls? Non-option in the current political climate. No, there's only one real answer to this. For Dirk to ensure that the story continues, he must take responsibility and be the villain himself. He will artificially introduce conflict and poke at the dead skull thing that helps facilitate their setting. He will get more points than the other team. He will seek his poorly defined goals. And to maintain narrative structure, he will also help seed a team of heroes to pursue him, and vent the self-loathing he's probably regressed to. Nevertheless, in this act of self-sacrifice, he will keep the light of the plot going for a while longer. Such is his design. Many suffer for it, and many will suffer more. One might say that the proper response would be to just talk openly with the others, and have them help with the awful truth he found. But then he wouldn't be an antagonist. And that is the tragedy of it all, how Homestuck deconstructs itself. At times, there is a place for villainy. Sometimes, you need the violent psychopath to function. And this is a pattern that repeats itself. First with Vriska, and then with the trolls themselves, whose peaceful predecessors were described as being too weak to handle pretentious sword art online. The game itself is the enemy. That's the real message here. The antagonist was just an especially visible symptom of that. It forces kids into suffering as part of an absurd process to grind them into what it thinks they should be, a monstrous process that deems those that fail it to be without value, and leaves them to ruin. An impractical process that, in the comic itself, generally results in failure, and is clearly intended to produce more of a show of things than anything. Otherwise, it wouldn't magically conspire to leave the sack with a bunch of 13-year-olds. It would reach out to SG-1 or something, and then they would tase Vriska for being stupid. In any event, some adapt well, but for many it is a horrible and traumatic process, surely one unjust for children. And yet, it is a reality. You cannot change it or challenge it. You can only accept it or be broken. This is the backdrop of a hero. Regardless of what others might think, Dirk will do what is right. And although many suffer for it, the prince will maintain control of the story, remaking it as he sees fit and letting things continue. This is his noble struggle, his last service, for himself, for everyone. But in doing so, he made one last, fatal blunder. Just because the story continues doesn't mean it's going to be good. What do you need to make a good story, really? You need interesting characters, ideally ones you care about, an interesting premise, and an interesting, at least somewhat logical progression of events that leads to a satisfying conclusion. Here is where the problems start. Let's begin with the characters. Remember how I said that everyone was an asshole in the epilogues? Yeah, well, there's even more to that than what I said at the time. The girl who was tragically manipulated into leaving her one true love and becoming a robot, Rose. What did she do in the timeline where this didn't happen? Oh, she cheated on her wife with a girl that had a canine penis, and then spent her time in the sequel pathetically trying to skate past responsibility for that. So this is what we missed out on in the meat path, huh? You know, somehow it feels a little less tragic now, doesn't it? In the timeline where Captain Stupid materialized, the racist world government is gearing up for full-on war and genocide against the trolls. During a battle, they drop a bomb on Captain Stupid's house, and he pretty much instantly crumbles, before sitting down in front of it and staring at the wreckage for an indeterminate period of time. The battle is still going on, by the way. Jane manages to subdue and capture some of John's friends. People are dying. And meanwhile, down below, you have ostensibly one of the most powerful men in the world sitting on his butt, staring forward like the end of 2001. Oh no, property damage. Several hours later, another one of his friends comes forward, and rightly calls him out for this. This is important. This is nothing less than a fight for the future of their world. Back there, he failed, and there are going to be consequences for this. For all of them. And John's response to this is, you know, normally this is a lot funnier. Could you exaggerate your anger to produce a comical itemized list to make the situation more digestible, please? You did that a lot in the original webcomic. Anyway, how was your sex life? We have to talk about your sex life, Carcat. That was also a thing that happened in the original webcomic. We have to have an extended discussion about our feelings, or I'm not moving a step further, you son of a bitch. This is a hold-up. I'm holding up the plot with my neurotic infantility, because that's who I am now. And this was the point where I started genuinely disliking John. He doesn't know he's a fictional character. In a vacuum, this could have been a decent moment, but it seems Homestuck 2 is more interested in making a subtle deconstruction of its predecessor, and using its main character as a sacrifice to do so. Put plainly, John just comes across as whiny, and stupid, and frustrating given the larger context of his story, and those three things do not make for a particularly likable character, especially in circumstances like these. Is this what it was all for? All that suffering and supposed character growth? For this? Why should I care about this guy? He should get run over by a cement mixer. I should stop reading. And then Karkat seems to succumb to emotional baggage too by the end of the scene. The virus is spreading. Anyway, so you might not find these characters likable, but are they interesting? People will forgive a lot in that case. Do they have something going for them? Some kind of new potential that could be explored? To answer these inquiries, I'm going to draw upon a conversation that takes place in the canon timeline between Dirk and Rosebot. So these two, right now, are potentially the most powerful characters in the setting. They are ultimate selves, and have broken free from the world to create a brand new universe. Why? What's their goal? Not their real goal, of course. We know the actual reason why Dirk's doing this, but there has to be an in-universe explanation as well, an actual story for people to latch onto. Well, in this case, they say they're going to directly guide their new creations, and try to steer them into playing the game themselves. Why? I don't know. Because the story needs to continue, that's why. Really, what I was looking for was an overarching design. Maybe Dirk wants to create a more ordered manifestation of his ideals, and that manifests as some kind of divine city. We get to see their personality reflected through their creations and how they clash against each other. Something. Instead, we just get a bunch of random crap that I could make in 10 minutes on Spore. The land as we see it lacks definition, lacks meaning. And the concept of playing the game again isn't that compelling if there's nothing presented as being behind it. Yes, it is true that the worlds in Homestuck could be a bit random, but they always had a unifying concept, or a larger point to them. Rose's planet is meant to be a comment on maturity versus cynicism. John's builds on the concept of freedom, etc. Or at least, they had enough happening on them so that they didn't get distracting. But here, the Roar XD random dogshitometer is out of control and right in your face, and the things happening on the planet otherwise are 2 blocks of wood blathering to each other about nothing. I hate the name we've given our planet, but I like the name we've given our planet. No, planet names must necessarily be bad or terrible. Our name meets both of those criteria. If it didn't meet those criteria, that would be bad. So in conclusion, we won't change the name of our planet. That is correct, we won't change the name of our planet. Oh my god, have fucking mercy. The conversations oscillate between giving a new definition to inanity and dropping elementary school level references to basic philosophy. The trolley problem? The allegory of the cave? Am I supposed to be impressed by this? Come back when you have a dissertation on Spinoza's ethics. It doesn't even make sense in this context. You're presupposing that the world would come to ruin on its own, and that your intervention would be a net positive. Like, did you not read any of the original comic? So, it's not interesting, and it's not edifying either. And that leaves us, the audience, with nothing. They go on, which is somewhat par for the course given their history, but from a writing perspective, you'd want to balance it out with something a bit more exciting. At first glance, it seems like another passenger, Terezi, will fill this role. But within 5 minutes of being subjected to this nonsense, she's like, fuck it, you guys are on your own, and leaves. Even the characters are giving up on making this a worthwhile experience. After Terezi leaves, her role is pretty much just to gawk at the insanely random animal life on the planet, and not even have the decency to kill it. There's one conversation that threatens to be interesting, but then Dirk swoops in and deliberately kills it. Bam! No fun allowed. Not on my watch. Which is so obnoxious and so condescending to the audience, I'm subtracting whatever points this initial part may have earned. After a certain point of reading Homestuck 2, you start to feel like you're getting pranked. Is that what's going on? Is this some kind of social experiment? Are they pulling an Evangelion and mocking fans for caring about these characters? Embrace reality. Care about the people there. Ha. Again, Dirk can't get over himself. And this is where things blow up in his face yet again. Because not only is he incapable of moving past his moral failings, but he's also incapable of moving past his intellectual failures as well. He understands that there has to be a logical progression to the story, but not that there has to be a deeper meaning behind it. There has to be a beauty to the sacrifice, a kind of aesthetic, not some cheap assembly line slaughterhouse. He refuses to examine his own aesthetics and fails to understand how others will view him, just like he was at the beginning of the story, just like Lord English. Except this time, it's not just his teammates he risks alienating. It's a mass of superdimensional beings that serve as judge, jury, and executioner. And as he continues to repeat the same mistakes and pulls the same dull, monotonous tricks, then they get tired of him. And then, as sure as night follows day, punishment follows. People didn't like Homestuck 2. They didn't like the direction many of the characters took. They thought the pacing was all over the place. The themes didn't land, and overall they considered it to be hollow and sanctimonious. The failure was so colossal, there was backlash against the real-world writers of the story, and even threats, which, of course, I condemn in the strongest possible terms. In any event, the writers were mentally unable to continue, and as a result of that, the story was put on an indefinite hold. In other words, it unceremoniously ended. Dirk's fears were realized. He was discarded. His friends were discarded. Everything was made into nothing. And the song of Pluto rang out in a lonely universe, forever. Yes, now everyone can be equally irrelevant. But of course, that's not the end of it. Because the original creator, over 2 years ago, said that the project was eventually going to be completed in the background and released once it was finished. And then they actually did come back. It wasn't all at once, but they did start making updates again, as of October 2023. At the time, I wasn't sure of how I felt about this. It was a bit sad to see the story end, and yet... It might sound strange, but I always thought the way the story dropped off was oddly appropriate. Not what happened to the people involved, of course, but strictly from an artistic standpoint, it made sense that Dirk would destroy Homestuck. His inability to tell a story, his unsightly excess, his assembly line dogma, all of them pushed everything to the brink and eventually over. He is the prince, after all. He is the destroyer. And it wasn't just him. The moral decay of everyone played a part in this. The indolence, the vanity. It had consequences. And it was fitting, like the evil acts of some tyrant finally crashing down on him, like the concept of completion itself. Like justice. And yet, here it is, back, like deleting System 962 in Undertale after a genocide run. No consequences, throwing one meaning out in favor of an uncertain second. Was it worth it? Well, let's see. I actually think the opening scene provides a pretty good insight. We start with adult Terezi Pyro playing in a make-believe courtroom, and wow, it actually looks kind of nice. Terezi is setting up a kangaroo court to righteously dispose of a piece of trash, identified by his poor facial hair, and the judge is like, by order of the Celestial Court, you are charged with the crime of terrorism. Are you guilty? Maybe. God damn it. And then... This is great. Look at her run! She's making the most of this. And, on a surface level, this exchange is charming. There is further pretense as the victim prepares to be sent on an express trip to Buttfuck Central. Terezi says, "You disgust me, worm," pulls out the comically small justification for all this, and then stops. This is stupid. You blink. What? And then you go back and actually read the lines. On the night of the crime, you were in my cave, were you not? But having rights is a hungry business. Hungry enough to eat a horse? And then you realize, this is just Terezi's introduction. But worse. There, she also pretended to be part of the alien court system. You have the heinous villain violating the law, but before, we had the eminently charming Senator Lemonsnout. Here, we have the mustachioed fuck-up. Back then, the villain brutally killed the lead witness, adding a sense of drama and flair to the event. Here, we have the fuck-up impotently spluttering, "I had the right to be there." What? No you don't. You don't have the right to be on others' property without permission. What the fuck are you on about? Ugh. Out of the way, Terezi. Back then, the case was resolved in a fairly clever manner, tying into the fact that she's blind. Here, there's no tie-in. We've never seen Terezi eat any horse-shaped snacks. Or anything at all in Homestuck 2, actually. It's a punchline without a setup. It's bullshit. Thank you, Homestuck 2, for drawing this to my attention. Oh, I'm sorry. You're just going by beyond canon these days? Okay, I understand. Anyway, the webcomic formerly known as Homestuck 2 follows this fuck-up by moving into another stylistic shift, and hey, this one's pretty good too. And it doesn't fuck up the dialogue this time. Granted, it's much shorter, but that's okay. I prefer briefer, non-fucked up lines. The contrast works well with her design, and it makes you wonder where she's going to go next. All we need now is a cast of quirky side characters and... Oh, that's right, we're in Homestuck 2. Back to harsh reality. After this, Terezi sees Rosebot's creations, and she's like, disgusting, before kicking it to the curb. Dirk shows up from his latest fart-sniffing marathon, and Terezi says, "I hate you. Watashi, I'm gonna dump ass on your whole race, bitch." And you might be thinking, okay, this is how they're going to do it. They're going to make her a stand-in for the audience, and in so doing, address their frustrations in a meaningfully substantive way. Until... The smudging. Therein lies the problem. The new story is attempting superficial fixes, but at its core, it's still confined by the poisons of old. That is not good. 3 swings, 3 misses. In a strangely poetic twist, it mirrors Dirk's previous failings, but because the story didn't end there will be no consequences. Incidentally, did you see the finalized name for Dirk's new race? Satyr, or maybe Satire. Are you excited for Arqueus multiplied by 10,000? Me neither. Next scene, please. Some girl is dead on account of a previous discussion regarding peanuts. Yeah, I have nothing to say here. Neither do the characters. Next scene! Whoa, what is this? That scene in Avatar: The Last Airbender, when the Zhangs were telling an obvious lie about Wei Jin? Is that what this is? No, it's a funky new art style that does not look good. But hey, none of these characters have noses, so I'll adapt on that front. Actually, this scene is my favorite of the bunch. Captain Stupid runs into Solix. He's a dick. But it fits with his character, and doesn't completely torch the themes of the story. Plus, Cap kinda had it coming. Oh, so you're staying here with my ex. Are you two sleeping together? What the fuck? What were you doing before this? I have a Wikipedia article to fill out, apparently. Dude, is your friend sleeping with her? Alright, listen. You're acting like this girl is your bitch, but you're wrong. If you want to see a real bitch, look in the mirror. With the way you're acting, you might even find more than one of them. I was the bitches? Boom. End scene. Perfect. Unironically the best scene in Homestuck 2, delivered to us by a mysterious gamer. Thank you, mysterious gamer. This scene has earned my seal of approval. Just need 7 more of those and maybe this sequel will be worth a damn. Maybe they've broken through a rut. Maybe it just needed a little time to get off the ground, and it's only up from here. Let's see. Oh. So here's the deal. Back when Captain Stupid was busy trying to suck his own dick, Jane actually captured Vriska. Vriska, who can manipulate luck, has godlike physical powers, delivered debatably the final attack on Lord English, and is regularly bailed out of her own stupidity by the plot. Strange, isn't it? The other characters think so too, but I actually interpreted that as being a way the non-canon nature of this timeline was manifesting itself. One of the characters did comment on how that meant their reality could be subject to dramatic and violent upheaval. Maybe this is a part of that. What's more, it interested me. The notion that a character as powerful as Vriska could just be subdued was significant, and more to the point, it was one of the precious few cases of non-canonicity actually having a material impact on anything. I mean, it's not like the characters were acting any more sensibly in the Meat timeline. What does non-canon mean? How does it work? Why is it seeming to act in Jane's favor? This development brought those questions back into focus for me. I liked it. How would it affect Vriska, or her relationship with Vrissy, who got dragged down with her? Saving her was set up as being a major character arc for John. It seemed like a great opportunity to break new ground. And now, we're going to see those questions answered. God damn it. Is there... No. No, of course not. You know, there was this movie I watched a long time ago, Stand By Me, starring Will Wheaton. In the movie, this group of kids hear about a guy that died and decide to go looking for the body themselves. They go on this big adventure, getting in all sorts of trouble and bonding with each other, but then, when they eventually do find the body, they grow silent and somber, suddenly unsure of what to do. Like, what were you expecting? A pot of gold? A Green Lantern power ring? It's a body. And that's just it. The reality of the moment catches up to them there. The reality of death. And although they do adapt to the moment, it's clear that they'll never be the same. If you can't tell, this is very similar to a comment I made earlier on Homestuck 2. It's a reality we all have to face, some of us more than others. It's a reference! Yes, I know. Oh, I know. But here's the thing, you mysterious woodland pixie. That doesn't make it good! First of all, Vrissy, who I'm just going to refer to as Pig Awful from now on, uses her biological privilege powers to just brainwash the guards into letting her out. That's not how troll mind control works, though. You can only directly puppeteer weaker trolls, and force humans asleep, or sense what they're thinking. That's what Arania, one of the most well-practiced trolls in this regard, said. And hey, if even the Condes couldn't use it to instantly force the kids to submit, then something's not right here. It has to be the non-canon power at work, the rules of the story changing, to support Pig Awful. So, the idea of non-canon being a force that the heroes have to overcome or endure in some meaningful capacity, that's out the window. Because now it's clear that the writers can just randomly use it whenever to bail the characters out of whatever. Harry surrounded by bad guys? That's no big deal. Because you see, he can teleport. Because he's John's kid or something. And Tavros can turn into the Hulk. And Yifany can change her name to something slightly less embarrassing, causing all enemies in the area to spontaneously burst into flames. Like, you see the problem? Of course, that would still technically meet the characteristics of non-canon. But it's not all about what technically fits. It's about how it's used in the story. This fundamentally changes the way non-canon works. And for what? There's no creativity to this. It's just a blind application of mindless power. It doesn't enrich the setting, and in fact does the exact opposite if you think about it for more than 2 seconds. And it doesn't lead to any new comedy either. The way Pig Awful acts afterwards is pretty much the exact same shit we've seen from her beforehand. With one exception, but I'll get to that in a minute. Because I'd like to back up and explain the other big reason why this scene is the equivalent of finding a body. So, in the Candy timeline, Jane is the antagonist. She's the leader of an increasingly authoritarian New World Order who wields all the power of society in her hand. A lot of the sequel is about the main character struggling, and more often than not, failing, to challenge this. John throws a temper tantrum. It doesn't work. Karkat screams that she's a fascist with his usual level of charisma. It doesn't work. These characters have incredible power. They could glass a country if they wanted, and have used their abilities to perform incredible feats in the past. But building a country is a little more complicated than killing monsters, and they learn that firsthand. The story, for all its flaws, has done a decent job preserving the tension here. Until now. Because now, a child is able to escape their imprisonment and pretty much steamroll the bulk of her army with no struggle at all. Do I have to explain how stupid that is? Why should I think Jane's capable of anything after this? How can the story possibly act as though she's any threat at all? It can't. It can only watch as the tension brushes out, leaving nothing but pretense and general stupidity. Fantastic. Reason 3 why this scene is so awful. It's the rule of 3, ladies and gentlemen, because we're talking about the one significant change in Pig Awful's character. That is, that she no longer likes Vriska Serket. See, I thought that was the way things might go. She was set up as a shitty toady early on, and I made jokes about it, but obviously she was going to break with Vriska at some point in a longer story. Maybe, being imprisoned by the evil world government would put things in perspective. Maybe once she's freed, after going through a harrowing experience in her own right, she can just say, "What the hell is wrong with you?" and the two of them would have a fight. Vriska would view her as being too fragile and needing to toughen up. And Pig Awful would just say, "You're fucking nuts." And that would mark the point that she becomes disenchanted with Vriska. Or maybe she actually is more protective of her friends than Vriska, and actually takes issue when one of them is hurt or discarded in her wake. Something to positively, meaningfully distinguish her. Which would be contrasted against the deconstruction of a more limited prior cast, showing the new kids to be an improved group ready to take on the challenges of the coming era. As heroes. So what actually makes Pig Awful break from Vriska? Is it getting imprisoned? No, she was still happy then. Is it declaring terroristic war on the planet? No. It's because Vriska said that the timeline was fake. Which is true, by the way. And Pig Awful got pissed. "How dare you say I am fake? I am my own girl boss!" That's pretty much exactly how that conversation goes. And in the span of 2 pages, with 0 actual dialogue, Pig Awful's previously well-established infatuation and hero worship of Vriska instantly goes kaput. Organically developing characters? What's that? Get in, samurai. We have plot beats to hit. And then, someone is delivering a speech to her legion of completely meaningless dipshits. She may as well be speaking to an empty room. When I first saw this scene, I thought, oh my god, they made Jane even more generic. What an achievement. She has a plan. It doesn't matter. She looks dumb. It means nothing. I shouldn't have gotten out of bed in the morning. And then Vriska talks with John about how stupid he was for thinking that someone as epic as her would need to be saved. And it's like, okay. Okay, Homestuck 2. I see how it is. Well, it's all just fun and games in the end, right? There are far more important things to be concerned about, like the fact that humanity is proving itself to be nothing more than a collection of ecocidal tumors on legs, eating their way through the world. Or that a significant bulk of my countrymen are swallowing obvious lies, living out a somehow even more ridiculous version of the Emperor's new clothes. Or that every mainstream existential narrative portrays the entirety of human endeavor as either completely pointless or destined for North Korean subjugation. Yes, this is meaningless. Just like everything else on this midden heap of a planet. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pull a Ben Sinister and pull the camera away from the protagonist before the end. And rather than continue on this path, I will do something else. In honor of my younger self, I will instead imagine a better sequel. A sequel that is everything I ever dreamed. A sequel worth existing. It's not a fully realized fanfiction, and it's not going to be. Even I have a little more dignity than that. But it will be the idea of a story, an abstraction of a story, something that you could project anything onto, even your heart and soul. And it will have a few significant changes in focus. First of all, the characters will be more likable. It's fine to make things more realistic. It's fine to deconstruct specific elements of the original story. But it's also important to do this carefully and strategically. Otherwise, you risk turning the characters doing it into a caricature, and that generally doesn't endear people to their cause. Dave saying, "Holy shit, that's disgusting," in the Troll's holy space provides a good balance, because it's funny. And Jane is an acceptable sacrifice, because she serves as a clear and relatively effective antagonist, albeit one that degraded a fair bit in time. But John whining about how he wants an itemized list after he failed his friends and let them fall into the clutches of an authoritarian regime, everyone aggressively not giving a damn that one of their friends committed suicide, that doesn't add anything. That's just terrible. And it sticks with you. The trick is to balance the character's flaws with more admirable traits. Compassion, comedy, drama, that sort of thing. But in both the cases I just described, among others, the flaws overwhelm and consume the characters, eating away whatever goodwill they may have built up so far. Now, fortunately, there's still plenty of room to correct this. Maybe John could meet up with Karkat and the other leading members of the rebellion and think to himself, what the fuck was that anyway? I'd better be more careful in the future. And then he is, persuading the others that he can be trusted in spite of his previous mistake. Or maybe Child Tavros could directly speak to Kanaya and ask how she's feeling, tacitly referring to Rose's infidelity, and Kanaya responds with appreciation, acknowledging that she is upset, but is putting it aside for the time being for the sake of the rebellion. Just little things like that, to acknowledge the state of affairs and to provide a clue that, yes, they'll be addressed. Obviously, the characters can still have flaws and make mistakes, but a proper sense of balance across the narrative as a whole would pay dividends. The second change in focus would be an immediate clarification and improvement on the stakes of the narrative. This would address the story's overarching problem with canon as a concept. In the original webcomic, relevance was pretty clear and straightforward. Either you showed up on screen and did things that mattered, or you didn't. Canon, however, is much less clear, which I get is probably intentional, but in this context, what could be a curious mystique instead crosses the boundary to becoming frustrating. Disregarding the obvious issue that both of these timelines are canon in the actual sense of the word, the bigger problem is that there really doesn't seem to be a meaningful difference between the one that is canon and the one that is not canon. When I was first reading the epilogues, I thought, well, there are probably going to be some pretty horrific consequences for the non-canon timeline. The world will slowly fade out of existence, the people will turn into Evangelion sludge, and John will realize what a horrible mistake he's made on the last few pages, ending with him being forcibly and gracelessly liquidated. That, however, didn't happen. Life went on as usual. John had kids of his own, and in fact, on a personal level, was much better off for his irresponsible decision. There's no existential threat at all, at least not one that we can see, and that makes all of Dirk and Rose's talk about dissolution kind of ring hollow. A secondary effect that Calliope discusses on the second-to-last page of Homestuck 2's original run is that the world not being canon means that their life is subject to random, nonsensical developments, because it's not canon, and that this is degrading. But again, the actual events of the story don't reflect this. The characters connect just as nonsensically and absurdly in the canon timeline, as exemplified in its presidential election. Jane is still racist, Jake still stands for the apparent normalization of sexual objectification, and Dirk literally mind controls something like half of the cast despite being the most canon of them all, in the process manipulating the entire electorate. How is that any less degrading? As it stands, canon as a concept is the main driver of the story's conflict, but as a concept, it isn't working. At points, it can come across like someone just making things up as they go. And the latest attempts by certain characters to say how insane the non-canon timeline is come across like the Wizard of Oz telling us not to look behind the curtain, or perhaps putting a band-aid on an amputated limb. That's bad. To make this central concept more meaningful, it's necessary to amplify the effects of the non-canon timeline. The difficult part isn't doing this organically. Obviously, Vriska randomly getting captured would be an ideal start to this, but it's only a start. And on this front, Jane is the key. She has an internal monologue that demonstrates her lust for power, control, and her own version of justice. She remembers Vriska, remembers everything she's done, including things that she shouldn't know about, and wants to punish her accordingly, publicly, before throngs of people cheering for her death. Something's not right. Furthermore, in time, non-canonicity would benefit from having a stronger, literal presence as well, not necessarily as a single character, but a formless essence that lies in the minds of others, particularly all extras. Think the greater ones from Bloodborne, something that mostly exists by implication and in the background, but can be brought to the forefront in certain cases. It would be the anti-Dirk, possessing its own desires and will, but not a set identity. And some of those desires could be a stand-in for the real-world desires of the fanbase, for better or worse. For example, the desire to see Karkat as a legitimately badass warrior, rather than the abrasive and sincere emotional core he was in the original series. The desire to see certain characters alive, and together. Vriska's active presence inflames it, because fan opinion on her is so divided. It wants to kill her, both from that and out of a sense of self-preservation. As she's in the prison stockades, being injected with troll suppressant and making snide comments to her counterpart, who's dazed out of her mind, "I can easily free myself, we just have to look for an opening." She looks over to one of the doctors attending her. And, abruptly, he smiles at her, in an ultra-stylized image akin to Junji Ito, looking like something that does not belong in Homestuck at all. Said stylization surges over the room. The effect only lasts for a second, but oddly, it reminds Vriska of her mother, and that's enough to get her to realize that something's seriously not right. By mother, I mean Lucis. Was it a hallucination? Or... Now, obviously you'd want to pace yourself on something like that. Just instantly having these factors fully present would be stupid in its own way. Instead of the image, you start out with just a few subtle clues in the background, an increased focus on social media and the artifice of image, perhaps a few subliminal clues based on the concept of what the people want, society incarnate, blurring the lines between genuine social commentary and horror. And then, finally, the reveal, which causes the spirit to start directly possessing people and clumping them together. Its name is Neo. In this way, there is a clear and impactful means to divide the canon timeline from the non-canon timeline, and that effect could make the main character's struggle more meaningful in the process. Thirdly, we will take a specific, carefully considered approach with Vriska. Look, real talk here. I like Vriska, and I hate Vriska. I hate her because she completely ruins the thematic thrust of the story. That isn't hyperbole. A comic that's ostensibly about becoming an adult and finding healthy ways to relate to others is decided by a murderous child who relies on her biological privilege power and is constantly bailed out by the plot. She's given every opportunity to learn from her mistakes, but doesn't. In fact, she derides the version of herself that eventually does learn. She makes a complete mockery of the story's sense of good and evil. But that's also part of the reason why I like her. She blatantly exposes the moral limitations of the series, in a frenzied fit of deconstruction that rivals Caliborn himself. And although the blatant double standards and gaslighting can be a bit annoying, at least she has violence to compensate. It makes you wonder after a while, is it intentional? Do the creators know what they're doing? Or are they too caught up in the idea of trolling their fanbase, or their own personal view of the character, to fully grasp the implications of her success on the narrative? The original Homestuck, somewhat cleverly, gave itself an out on this. Vriska's nowhere to be found after the final battle, and there's a clear implication that she died in the final explosion. This both grants Vriska's wish, and simultaneously punishes her for her crimes. She got what she wanted, she got to be the most important character, but she couldn't move past that. She couldn't be part of a better world, of a peaceful world. She's just as locked in as the antagonist. And she deserves it. Not because of her past, but because of the choices she made, right to the end. A tragedy, perhaps, a necessary sacrifice in desperate times, one that humanity hopes to move on from. From that, the story could still ultimately affirm the more compassionate, equitable approach of the other characters. But then Vriska came back, and wow, what a surprise, she's still a horrible person. Let me make it clear. If Vriska gets to be the big hero again, it'll take away even this justification, and there will be nothing left. It'll be a sign that the privileged and cruel are not only destined to be the most powerful, but that they don't even have to change to deserve it. It'll be a sign that virtue and compassion are just another tool to be used and discarded by the extraordinary. It will be a testament to the supremacy of power. Now, of course, you can still tell an interesting story from that. It all depends on where you want to take things, and the message you ultimately wish to convey. And yes, it is that important. Vriska has been propped up as the deciding factor here. The way she's treated will make a difference between two radically different prevailing worldviews. People looking at her from Homestuck 2 alone might say, well, they're obviously treating her as a villain. But then, in a broader context, that's not very clear, is it? Either way, in this version of the story, we'll play to her strengths. Her original assault after declaring war was a good start, but only a start. In time we see more, preferably with more of a visual component to it as well. Just a lurid display of obscene ultraviolence, Omni-Man levels of ultraviolence. Men being torn limb from limb, the streets running red with blood and rough with entrails. That would be very entertaining, and show the general public that she means business. For the villain angle, she could potentially be a superior Dirk, whereas he's divided and impotent, spinning his wheels endlessly in meaningless koans. Vriska is certain, and willing to do anything to achieve her goals. She could return to the house, kill Calliope as the hyper-relevant action stated as necessary to free them, because what else would it be? What, is she going to sing a song? We're not going to take it? Nah, no way. And then Captain Stupid can just stare at her and dumbly say, "Huh?" as his neurons slowly splutter out the revelation that she is not a good person. Actually, that would be a good way to endear us to the new cast of children. I said it before. And then while Vriska is bathing in the blood of Calliope, she makes a wrestling promo against Dirk, declaring that she is going to be the most canon person ever. That will be entertaining as well. The sad thing is that I kind of agree with Vriska's evaluation of the world. She says that the world is shit and that the new John sucks. And I'm like, well, she's not wrong. She says that the only proper solution is to burn it all down. That's probably inaccurate, but at this point it's what I viscerally desire, so I'm going to agree regardless. But being directionally correct on this matter is not sufficient. She may affirm my worldview, but at the expense of the likely intention of the story. In addition, she's not entertaining enough to make watching her worth it. And, more importantly, the other parts of the story that compensated for her have fallen off. That is not good. She needs something more to reach her full potential. An improvement to the existing cast, a clarification of stakes beyond some arbitrary garbage and empty assertions, a fundamental strengthening of one central character's role, playing to her strengths and helping to divide the old cast from new. But there is one more change to take place, one even more important than the others. Aridin needs to be brought back into the story. Yeah, that's right, Aridin, the Prince of Hope, who slaughtered the angels en masse, and did this, and this, and this. Listen. This story cares about politics, right? Well, a notable part of the political landscape nowadays involves young men feeling alienated from others, and as a result feeling driven into more extreme views for the sake of connections and a sense of order. Maybe they're being manipulated, maybe they aren't, but the consequences are real and frightening. What is the proper response to this? Should they be ignored, despite the potential risk? Should they be excised, like parting the wheat from chaff? Or can they be helped? Now, in my view, this metaphor is a bit flawed when it comes to Aridin. Yes, he is a murderous virgin. Yes, he is obnoxious. But, according to the narrative itself, he literally is biologically predisposed to instability and bloodlust. Plus, his support group either abandons or outright mocks him, making it appear more like a case of someone suffering from a mental health disorder going untreated. It's not like it's hopeless either. There are clearly signs that he's capable of improvement, both in the original story and without. But those cases never fully manifest because it's hard. Because it's easier, and frankly far more appealing, to just demonize him. And so they do. I can empathize with that approach. In addition, Aridin is directly linked to one of the most powerful aspects of the series, hope, and has significant combat prowess. And he was linked to a prophecy to defeat the main villain of the series. There would be immediate and obvious benefit to him turning to the side of good, whereas incels, for the most part, are just hopeless, disgusting humans. There's a comically blatant double standard between him and Vriska, which Vriska herself even acknowledges at one point. She's given a million chances and multiple resurrections to change. Aridin, at age 13, is huffily wiped away less than halfway through the narrative with no proper conclusion to his character arc, despite Vriska killing way more people and being way more shitty in general. There's genuine cause for grievance there. Despite these discrepancies, however, I think he is still an effective representative for wayward young men that suffer from loneliness and a lack of direction. There's significant potential that has hitherto gone untapped in this political epic, and we are going to drag it up like a body being dragged from the lake. He serves as a member of the rebellion, where his natural potential in firearms is put to good use and appreciated by Mina. He's fairly effective, both in combat and general strategy, but still has emotional hang-ups, in part because Feferi told him off a while back. However, those emotional hang-ups have changed over time. He has changed over time, and that is part of the reason why he's relevant within the rebellion. Because despite being a ghost and not having access to any mystical artifacts, at some point, Eridan came back to life and matured into adulthood several years ago. This is, in truth, because of the underlying non-canonicity of the world, which Eridan unconsciously harnessed to reflect his wishes. But he doesn't understand this, and neither does anyone else. It's not something he can do regularly. But it is something that seems important. Feferi's telling him off really did make an impact. It was incisive and harsh and got right to the heart of his victim complex. However, Mina came to him in a dark time and was able to recruit him into the rebellion. He obeyed and found himself part of a group that finally made sense to him, one that was dedicated to the destruction of the human order, something his skill set was particularly well adapted to. Of course, he falls for Mina, but remembering his past failures, he finds himself desperate to not repeat them. He's too hesitant to confess his feelings for her, too frightened of failure. He finds himself wishing that he was the same age as her, and then that he was worthy of her. That mentality permeates his character. He cynically discards his distaste for lowbloods and hides his distaste for humans because of her. He tries his best to make her designs work from the council, and he actually is pretty effective when he deliberately quiets his personality and focuses purely on logistics. He even makes an effort to understand others for the sake of efficiency, and is fairly well respected in the community, at least on a superficial level. However, despite all this, he still doesn't speak up, because, in his mind, he'd never be worthy of her, and any attempt would only end in failure. Because he is a failure. The story treats him like that, and anyone who actually knew him in the past can see through his change, viewing him with derision and contempt. It's all fake, after all. And so, he never says anything. What's the point? Why ruin a decent friendship and some tepid admiration from the group? There are, in the end, two reasons for Eridan's character development. First, he's given up on love. In his mind, he'll be forever alone. And he's made peace with that. Second, he believes he has a clear path in life. That is, the destruction of the human government. He'll never be loved. He'll never know what it's like to be wanted, to be cared about, to be a part of that sensation that comes so easily to others. But he can at least receive praise for destroying the world. He can ensure that there's a future for his people. He can make sure he doesn't let his friends down. He can redeem himself, technically. That narrative, that once sickly and sweet self-hatred harnessed against the enemy, the desire to see a story completed at long last, that is what triggers the ultimate return of his hope powers. You might be saying at this point, dude, this hardly sounds like Eridan anymore. This sounds like the shittiest self-insert in all of existence. First of all, my self-insert would not go gentle into that good night. He will be using his cosmic awareness to achieve absolute power, before using said power to kill half the cast and turn the setting into an erotic horror comedy that no one in their right mind would enjoy. Or trying to flee to Switzerland, depending on the circumstances. Second, dude, this hardly sounds like Eridan anymore. Yes, that's why it's consistent with Homestuck too. Jane wasn't a horrible person in the original story. Rose wasn't carnally interested in furry culture to the point of betraying her wife. People change over time, sometimes dramatically, and at times, all we can do is hope for the best. Isn't that the point of hope? To believe that, even if it's rare, even if the odds are 1 in a million, things can be better? That even the worst person can change? A lot of Homestuck 2 seems interested in deconstructing that message. All the changes we see are negative, and as far as redemption is concerned, well, it wouldn't work for Vriska, because she's been given 50 million chances already. And it wouldn't work for Gamzee because you chose to make him a pedophile. Which brings the count up to 4, by the way. Why not have one character actually put in a sincere effort to make the best of things? If dreams can't come true, then why not pretend? And it would fit, too, in a number of different ways. Princes in the setting of Homestuck tends to be at their most effective when they're working on the commands of another. Kurlaw from Gamzee, Dirk from Vriska, and now Aridin from Mina. A big part of Dirk's character, back when it seemed like he was actually going to learn something, was in contrasting his current mentality with his 13-year-old self's mentality, being more self-aware and reflective. And remember, Aridin originally died at 13 years old. He would actually serve as a bit of a twisted parallel to Dirk. Having read his self-help book, he's more mature and direct, even abandoning his typing quirk to better appeal to others. But to people that knew him, this is just off-putting, like he's putting on an act. Which, in a sense, he is. But not in the way they think he is. They think he's just interested in sex, but he's really just interested in feeling better about himself. Which he's attached to some pretty fucked up things. Oh, and he's also more competent. Not that that's an especially high bar to clear. In addition, he's more vicious, finding physical release in only the rage of battle. This could be attributed to the difference between his and Dirk's aspects, whereas Dirk destroys heart, and as a consequence his own self-awareness, Aridin destroys through his hope, and knows his issues precisely. The infinity of choices it represents collapses into a single, dogged path. He knows what he must do, and does it. The main reason for his success would be that he's capable of understanding what Jane thinks, a comment on her descending sanity, and his fault would be an increased bloodlust for humanity. Is it because he blames them for his problems? Has he developed some awful fetish? Or is it just the pleasure of seeing another perceived obstacle removed? That ambiguity would be a source of tension. He does hold himself back with humans aligned with the rebellion, after all. Thematically speaking, in retrospect, the whole thing would be a comment on social anxiety, mental health, and the nature of self-improvement. In other words, the issues faced by the average incel. It would seriously acknowledge the problems they face, while, wait for it, lightly mocking them as well. It would mock their tendency for self-pity. Even Aridin's moved on from that, and at the same time mock the movements and constructive responses they can transition into. Incels themselves would surely view Aridin as a simp or whatever, but he's really just burying himself in a political ideology, not unlike what a lot of them do. Having read the self-help book, he has made genuine improvements, but that's not enough. Just as he's respected in the community on a superficial level, he's only superficially addressed his own issues. As an adult, he probably would be able to find someone interested in him, but he doesn't, because he would fail, because the act has become his truth, because he's obsessed with Mina. And the tragedy of it all is that he's not wrong in his fears. His real self would be rejected. The people would hate him as much as everyone else. Mina herself knows his feelings and privately views him as a loser, a joke, a weapon to be fired and disposed of without a second thought. Useful, but disgusting. Only worth keeping around as long as he does what she wants. And even that has its limits. This could be a commentary on, hey, be careful which horse you hitch yourself to. Aridin meets with John and the others, and works with them on the operations leading up to Vriska's rescue. He really doesn't like John, because from his perspective, John's been an immature asshat this whole time, and still got to be in a loving relationship. Despite this, he acknowledges that John is one of the most powerful people in the world, and that he is willing to help him in a more productive manner than before. Hopefully. Skipping ahead a bit, John continues to get under Aridin's skin. The two of them are part of the team that's going to save Vriska, and on Mina's insistence, Aridin is going to personally lead the charge to kill Jane. Having observed Aridin's behavior before, John wants to understand him, and asks about his past. Despite Aridin giving his own stock answers about how he's more interested in the future, John presses further and further until Aridin snaps and punches a hole through the wall. Narrowly avoiding an outburst of his own inner feelings, he makes some brief, stammering, half-formed statement about how John doesn't understand, before biting a hole through his lip, making it bleed, and then politely asking if they can move on. That's what lets John know he's not right in the head. Aridin talks about how no one else who knew him believes he's changed, and about how much he dislikes John. He also talks about how much he dislikes Vriska too, but that doesn't matter. He just wants the whole thing to be over, and John is silent. The actual operation involves saving Vriska in the midst of her public kangaroo trial, which is taking place in the Roman Colosseum. After reciting Vriska's crimes to a bloodthirsty public, Jane, now half possessed by Neo, declares that she will be executed for the glory of mankind. This should parallel Eridan's darker moments. The gang charges in, even though it's a trap, and have a big battle royale. It's hard, but in the end Vriska is freed, and laughs, fleeing while she declares that Jane's world is doomed. This is unexpected, given how the rebellion expected her to fight alongside them. They continue, but an enraged Jane changes the tides of battle, forcing the heroes to retreat. But Eridan, told to kill Jane, refuses. With his hope powers returning at the prospect of a conclusion, he fights Jane and her group viciously, hope against non-canonicity. There's some ironic bickering between them, and it is a tense fight, helped by the fact that Eridan has channeled non-canonicity in the past. People actually stop to stare. It seems like it could go either way. But, in the end, Eridan loses. Despite his abilities, Jane is directly connected to Neo and regenerates her wounds quickly. Meanwhile, Eridan's damage just accumulates, and despite his hope and rage, he is eventually brought low. Jane, with her goons, gloats to him about the supremacy of human ingenuity, and with Neo, reveals in lurid detail just what Mina thinks about him. Eridan isn't surprised, or even really fazed by it as he tries to attack her again, perhaps preparing a suicide attack. Jane prepares to expedite his execution. But then, surprisingly, John comes in to save him, despite being told it's a bad idea. He risks his own life, charges in, and with his power manages to knock Jane off of him. Because now, he's seen what Eridan's dealing with. Now, in a sense, he understands, and he's not going to let someone else commit suicide. Eridan is unable to understand as John carries him off, and they narrowly escape. In the aftermath of this, Eridan asks John why he saved him, and John, grasping for an answer, eventually responds, because that's what heroes do. And that makes Eridan even more upset, because it puts things in perspective. Because he doesn't want to be a hero. He just wants to be loved for being a hero, and they're not the same thing. But John doesn't have time to talk with him. There are other problems now. Vriska, upon returning, almost immediately went to Calliope and fucking murdered her. With John and Roxy in attendance. John is like, Roxy is like, But Vriska tells them that the only way they'll escape is by getting the attention of the alternate Calliope that helped sustain their world, and the only way to do that is to kill her other avatar. She offhandedly states that the alternate Calliope will probably bring her back to life when she returns, maybe. And Roxy, remembering how Vriska essentially did save her, does reluctantly accept this, despite being stunned and horrified. John is a bit less impressed, and starts to tell her off, but Vriska tears into him, saying that she's sick of his whining, and that there's no place for it anymore. Times have changed. And then she goes off to join the rebellion. The government becomes more overtly dystopian. The rebellion is gaining power, but it's also starting to splinter. Vriska's luck-based powers are helping to make their plans succeed, no matter how stupid they are, but she also has a more cavalier attitude towards the lives of her subordinates, and throws them away on an often comedic whim. Because of this, no one in the rebellion likes her. Many think being imprisoned by Jane did something to her mind, especially the other humans. This is actually true, by the way. She was legitimately afraid of Neo, and is now trying to tear down as much of its world as she can, both out of spite and a desire to prove that she actually is the badass she thinks she is. Of course, she wouldn't acknowledge that to anyone else. To them, she just looks like a psychopath. Most of the humans want to bring Vriska to heel, but things haven't stopped moving on the other side. Neo seems to have taken over the minds of the common people not already aligned with the rebellion, turning them into largely unthinking dystopian drones that believe the only way to preserve humanity and freedom is to stamp out the anti-government forces. You could put a lot of political commentary there. And the world is slowly starting to lose shape, with fissures and earthquakes emerging regularly. Anyway, a lot of people are afraid that without Vriska, they'll lose to whatever that thing is. And so, they reluctantly go along with her. Mina, incidentally, is just tickled pink with Vriska's return, and hits on her shamelessly. She thinks Vriska's whole shtick is hilarious. Karkat tries to do his best and preserve lives where he can. John and the kids do the same as they launch attacks and defend against the dystopian armies. Rose argues against Vriska's tactics, but is largely ignored. Eventually, however, it is Aridin who stands up to Vriska, having somewhat gotten over his despair and returning to his act. Karkat has died, in no small part because of her bullshit. Sneering, he tells Vriska that it's not all about her, and that she has to respect the strategy of the council if she wants to be part of the rebellion. And he does have the authority and sway in the group, even if just superficially, to get them to turn against her. And she tells him off too, sweeping his leg and deriding what a loser he's become. Aridin starts to fight back with his hope powers, and the others start to help him, but Vriska takes the hint and says she's leaving, mockingly stating that they should see how far they get on their own. Just then, alternate Calliope arrives. A whole bunch of shit happens from there. Vriska immediately tries to leave. Alternate Calliope holds her down and drags her along while she attempts to stabilize the world, disturbed at how things could have gone so wrong. And Neo itself surges up to try and take alternate Calliope's power. Maybe flesh this out a bit more. The important thing is that Vriska was lying about Calliope being brought back, and that this is functionally the endgame. The world is breaking apart from the sheer existential pressure being placed on it, and soon everyone left behind will die. Alternate Calliope left the way open for people to flee in case she fails, which she does. John, the heroes, and the rest of the kids flee. Aridin helps guide his people through, and is appreciated for it. Still, he chooses to go after Vriska, who reminds him of the past he wants gone. And, though he doesn't show it, the appreciation doesn't really matter to him anymore. Vriska herself did manage to escape the collapsing world through another rift. The alternate Calliope died in the resulting fight, which Vriska caused by striking against her to break free, consequently creating an opening for Neo. As it started to consume her, the world broke down and seemingly destroyed them both. But, in her cowardly tactics and brief hesitation to gloat before leaving, part of Neo attached itself to Vriska before she could leave, effectively dooming her in the long run as it escapes into canon. She briefly sees the others, who are not happy to see her, and sneers, saying that she has bigger fish to fry. In other words, Dirk. This is, in part, what motivates Aridin to go after her. He sees too much of himself in her, which means she is an enemy. The next part of the story has the following sides to it. Dirk and Rose, Vriska with the Neo-Parasite, Candy Davebot and his Dumbo posse, John and the other Candy heroes, who are eventually joined by Meat Dave and his ship, and Aridin, who's still internally undefined and acting out the vague role of a hero. Now, I have a confession to make. I always knew when I started this that it was going to be a balancing act, measuring comedy, drama, and my own sanity. I did write out the details for each of these plot lines, but in the end I had more to say than I thought. Quite a bit more, actually, bleeding over the 50-page mark in a matter of hours, even with my abbreviated synopsis style of writing. And it was at that point that I realized I was putting way too much effort into it. I don't know. Maybe, if the peanut gallery pleads loudly enough, I could put out the rest of it. But for now, I'd like to move on. There are newer Aridins, and better. So, for the time being, here's a simple description of the subsequent adventures. Star Trek with a before in Trolls. Persona 5 crossed the Iraq War. The original Homestuck, with Irani appearing over the edges of the chessboard. Fodder. More emotional upheaval than the room in Othello, with more blood than the Book of Revelations. Fate Zero in the land of B-stars during the Soviet Revolution. And so on and so forth. There is a vast swell of adventure, synthesizing the long discussion and gameplay specifics of the old world with the vanity and indolence and want of the new. And it is good. A story that justifies all the misery that went into it. A story that does not maintain the terrible macro-scale concepts while reversing the few actually good initial ideas in a seemingly deliberate attempt to produce the worst thing imaginable. and that was going to be it. But I figured that I would put in one final detail. One final window of light into the universe that I imagine. A principal concern with this series is the continuation of evil across space and time. Caliborn wanted to play a game. Billions died. Bro beat Kid Dave's butt once upon a time. Adult Dave became pro-suicide. And many of the blue blood trolls, like Vriska, strive to follow the example of their own ideal. A murdering rapist pirate who died to shit blood supreme once upon a time. Great. Vriska bases herself on that, and it's at least half of the reason she's such a terrible person. Pig Awful, in turn, follows that example. And in a roundabout kind of way, the other blue blood of the story does as well, motivating her into becoming another antagonist. It doesn't end well. In doing so, they often get themselves into trouble. And in this, and the resulting fallout, the story poses another question. Can these people change? Can anyone change? Of course, it wimps out of this with Vriska in favor of a might makes right message, and it seems as though it's going down the same route with Pig Awful. But the third blue blood, that is where one of our final focuses lies. Arania, in the second part of the story, in the black depths of space, serves as a secondary antagonist. That's right, she just can't leave well enough alone. She just barely managed to escape death by channeling Eridan's non-canon powers in secret. She stayed underground, away from prying eyes, and yet, despite this unprecedented good luck on her part, she can't stand the fact that she failed. It can't end like this. It can't end like this. And yet, it did. Everyone always says that it's important to take chances, that it's better to try and fail in life, because otherwise, you'll never know. Personally, I think those people have never experienced true failure. Imagine it, putting forward everything you have, all your time, effort, and care, months, years, all the dread force of necessity and desperation, only for it to be crushed. It could be in politics, art, life, love, but there is nothing like seeing your best made immaterial. It's different from never knowing. It's knowing that you can't. As a general rule, stories are about people that succeed. They beat the monster, they save the day, they change the people. But not everyone is like that. Some people are just destined for failure, and they face a very different set of questions and standards than their fellows. So, how does Arania respond to this? In a word, poorly. She keeps trying, refusing to give up, and also, importantly, refusing to compromise herself. She spent so much of her life keeping quiet, on the sidelines, getting stepped on. No more. She wants to be a hero. She wants her life to mean something. And in that ravening, frustrated desire, she causes quite a bit of trouble for the main cast. It isn't as immediate as her descendant, or as meaningful, really, but in the new universe, she takes many different approaches to try and achieve power. She tries to manipulate Meat Dave into becoming a tyrant. She manipulates the full release kids, Harry in particular, to start a special variant of Spurb, with her own stain on it. Through these avenues and more, she tries to accumulate power and curry favor with a demon far off in canon. And although she is still capable of putting on a mask of kindness and patience to achieve her end, it's apparent, especially in private, that she's gone downhill. For one thing, she knows that she's a fictional character, and unlike Dirk, who's mostly just an aloof piece of shit with a mouth, she's completely unafraid to just yell at the camera, engaging the audience in comical, one-sided conversations referencing the plot, story elements, and of course, the multiverse. Oh, so you're too cool for self-aware characters, huh? What the fuck do you want? Do they have to reach out and grab you by the throat? She says stuff like that too, aware of how played out the self-aware trope is, and desperately trying to figure out where else to go. Where can you go, then? It is a mystery. There's a mix of frustration, lust, and reverence as she attempts to force her designs on reality. She mocks the heroes as she does so too, cracking jokes and acting like some bastardized Marvel hero. She's trying to be my self-insert. But, silly child, that position has already been filled. By nobody, and everybody, at the same time. And if you can't understand that, you can just get out of my face. In terms of her attitude, she's like Handsome Jack, Deadpool, Velma, and Dr. Affinitivus from Sonic the Hedgehog. Who? Precisely. Despite her absurdity, she is fairly effective, at least early on. And yet, in the end, she fails. She fails at achieving power from any of her avenues. And when that happens, and her options dry up, her desperation resurfaces, and, muttering obscene things under her breath, she tries one last means to get upon Aridin, who is approaching the boundary to Dirk's world himself. Aridin, at this point, has had enough. He's helped a world at war, only to be betrayed by its people. He's seen gods devour their people, and the sheer prevalence of evil in the universe. And he's seen it in himself. Two demons, embodying death and delusion, have facilitated these encounters, and for their own ends, they have made him stronger, both through sheer might and hope. But ironically, despite the latter, he has been worn down by this point. His remnant interest in heroism has pretty much worn away, and even his desire to kill Vriska is being overrun, not with sadness, but with exhaustion. He wants this to be over. He's wanted it for a long time. He wants an answer. And Arania was meant to provide that answer, mind-controlling him and achieving a more perfect, powerful application of hope than ever before. After all, she was able to command Cronus, and her ability is stronger than ever before. His power, and her will, the means to a perfect hero, the means to conquer the universe. This was part of the demon's plan, and Arania, grinning savagely, finally does come across him, her fears of being undone by some other bullshit allayed. Her heart pounding, she barely has the presence of mind to even attempt a manipulative facade. Aridin, however, accepts it. He knows, intuitively, what she is and what she wants. But he doesn't have the strength to resist it. He wants to believe in something. He wants to stop thinking. Arania doesn't think anything of it. It'll be the easiest brainwashing yet. It's destiny. Finally, there is no fight. She lays both of her hands on his head and activates her power. And yet... The reason why the demon let Arania do her work was because, despite his work, he couldn't get Aridin to come to the active hatred for life he desired. Such things require a combination of pride and rage. And it might have worked when Aridin was 13, but now, in seeing those flaws in himself, he has no pride. And although it has been quieted significantly, he is, in the end, extremely self-pitying. This has ironically given him a kind of empathy. They all have a reason for acting this way, after all, and disgust. A desire to flee rather than fight. A desire for something else. Hope is unpredictable in that way. However, rather than completely hollowing him out as she desired, Arania experiences an explosive psychic shockwave as feedback. And then something strange happens. Aridin's memories flow into her, and hers flow into him. The murder, the obsession with an ideal, the rejection, and then the long stretch afterwards. She knows it's absurd. She knows she's seen worse, that this is completely and utterly pathetic. But memories are about more than just logic. She feels how he felt at the time, how truly awful he felt, how meaningless, and it reminds her of herself. Arania screams weakly, falling to the burned field below like Icarus. She's been burned by the feedback, and although she recovers quickly, she stares up at the sky blankly, unable to move. And just like that, everything falls on her. She failed to rewrite the original timeline. She failed to take ownership of the new. She failed to wield the last sword of hope, and she can't even fight off the hideous feelings spreading inside her. The failure is so complete that it brings Arania to her senses. She is no hero. She has no great destiny above anyone else. And if there is anyone out there, they're not answering. Not to her. A single tear rolls down her cheek, and then the prince appears before her, blocking out the sun. He too experienced her memories. He too saw a bit of himself in them. And yet, that determination, that faith, that total confidence, it made him feel just a little better. It's just terrible, isn't it, when you lose control like that? None of my friends cared about me. I was just a tool at best, and a nuisance at worst, to be shoved to the side when convenient. It made me angry, so awesomely angry that I could feel my head spinning. But more than that, I was sad. And more than that, I was confused. Where did I go wrong? I was never able to find an answer. Even after tearing through half of the universe, I still don't have one. And now, it seems, you couldn't give me one either. But you did give me something, even if it wasn't intentional. And more than that, I know it's hard. I know what it's like to feel this way. And that's why I'm not going to leave you. I'll be here until you get up. And he sits beside her. A long time passes. Arania knows there's no point in saying anything. He already knows her story. There's no point in saying anything. Ordinarily, at this point, she'd be sobbing hideously. But she stares at him for a minute, silently. She notes that he does seem to be in better spirits, and it makes her feel something. She does sit up, and stands, making eye contact with the prince for a long while, seeing herself in him. She swallows. He's disgusting, but then, so is she. A hero. She wants to forget all of that for a while. And maybe... She abruptly gives a loud and humorless laugh. He stares at her, feeling exactly what she's feeling. Her hair, her eyes, her hands. Not to put too fine a point on it, but everything is drawing him closer. Well, a person is more than just their memories. Why don't I give you a tour myself? Oh, please. He takes her hand, and Arania uses the last of her special power to make both of them vanish into all the dream bubbles she's accumulated over the years. Arania says it's another attempt to brainwash him, this time over a longer period, but not even she believes that. She just has fun showing him parts of her own life that weren't quite so awful. He listens. He responds with his own stories, becoming more open than before. They bond over Alternian imperial history and stories of magic. They share the same sensibilities. The relationship, in time, turns romantic, instigated by Arania, although Aridin would have taken initiative soon after. And there it stays. It is an equal relationship, with both challenging the other, but never too much, and never too harshly. They know each other perfectly, and their feelings are like a living dream. Mind you, this is the end point. It's after both of these characters have drank deep from the well of bloodshed and trauma, and been pushed to the brink for one reason or another. It's a catharsis. It's a miracle, absurd and absolute. Those so far from standard humanity, those falling to nihilism and dogma, were in the end saved by a single, simple connection. One forged by extraordinary circumstances, but ultimately one you can find anywhere in the world. In the highest tower, in the lowest hovel. Love. A relationship between a man and a woman. So petty, so small in the grand scheme of things. But size is a matter of perspective, and although it's not enough for everyone, it certainly is for them. You might consider this whole thing to be wholly artificial, and yes, that is intentional. You see, in some respects, Arania and Aridin's flaws were opposites of each other, egotism in Arania's case, and self-pity in Aridin's. As such, in a sense they needed a bit of the other to balance themselves out. Arania needed to be knocked down a peg. More than that, she needed to accept and find value in smaller things. Aridin needed to believe in, well, anything in life, really, but mostly himself. And yet, the two of them had a shared flaw as well, one that went deeper than the other and prevented the two from addressing them, one that nearly destroyed their lives, a resistance to change. Seeing the other gave them a new perspective. It showed them that other ways were possible. They both rubbed off on each other, and in that way, they both won, no matter how unlikely it seems. Again, isn't that the nature of hope? The belief that anyone, no matter who they are, can change? It's easy to fight when the odds are in your favor. But to keep going, to keep dreaming, even when everything seems lost, that is hope. That is the greatest aspect of them all. Sometimes it pays off. It draws on earlier scenes in the story. Vriska herself had moments of doubt in the original comic, and opportunities to change. opportunities to be the true hero. They were just wasted. Because circumstances demanded it. Because she didn't want to. Because she didn't have to. Whatever the reason, she sank to her own worst aspects. And the results? Like it or not, Vriska's story, and by extension, the story of those closest to her, is important to Homestuck as a whole. It's a story of power and control, struggling to impose your will on a world that's just as awful as you are, and how you justify yourself in the face of all that. Vriska is a horrible person who delights in cruelty, but she defends her actions as being necessary. The alternatives are too weak, incapable of doing what must be done. Even though it's blatantly obvious that this isn't the case. It's cynicism versus maturity. And in the end, it's cowardice against acceptance. Vriska doesn't have the heart to accept herself as a monster, and she also doesn't have the courage to accept that she could be kinder in strength. The result is a tragedy. In the original Homestuck, anyway. In Homestuck 2, it's mostly a travesty. But to fully explore her story, to fully understand what's been lost, you need to show what could be. And that is the ultimate purpose of Arania's final twist in the story. During the story, Pig Awful has a well-deserved identity crisis. And Vriska, well...
No matter how many midichlorians you got, you still just a Jedi.
But Arania ultimately takes a different path, partly because of external circumstances, but also because she ultimately chose to accept them and change. She achieves the happiness she once thought was beneath her, and doesn't even need to abandon her relevance completely in the end. For in the end, the last of Arania's special ability dries up, and her time and memories with Eridan ends, only to find that he's permanently warped the land into a jumbled approximation of her dream, with his now fully realized hope powers. During their time in dreams, they weren't just luxuriating. They are trolls, after all, and delighted as much from going on adventures, training, destroying monsters and angels. They spoke of destroying those that held them back, like the heroes of old. Vriska, the demon, and Dirk. Incidentally, this whole thing also serves as a thematic parallel to Dirk and Rose. Mind you, this isn't any successful brainwashing on Arania's part, just organic discussion in dreams. Eridan himself was actually the one to put it forward. Eridan, for the most part, has lost interest in the hemaspectrum. Entering a relationship put things in perspective for him. He's a lot more stable now, and doesn't even hate John or the others. He simply wants to, in his words, destroy those that he knows have done evil, and be sincerely respected as powerful and worthwhile by those around him. There is a yet childish, but ultimately healthier nature to this. He just wanted to find something to believe in. And he did. Faith in bonds, faith in himself, faith that at least one person truly understands him. Hope that everyone, no matter who they are, might one day find a better tomorrow. And, when they are released, they set out together, now with the power they need to stand alongside the other existential forces at play in the finale. Will it be enough? Maybe. Or, you know what? Fuck it. Yes. Yes. Yes, because I like happy endings. Although the ensuing battle is difficult, with the help of everyone, Dirk is defeated, and the surviving members of the cast, including Eridan and Arania, set up a new home on Detritus, accepting the limitations of their existence and living happily ever after. And it is good. Nevertheless, this is in the end a video about Dirk Strider, so let's get back to him. Dirk sucks. Having adopted a poorly conceived ideal of heroism that fetishizes misunderstanding and fails to play to common human strengths, he finds himself evaluated by metrics of power, intellect, and heart, and fails in all three. He is punished for it, and given an opportunity to learn and embrace his humanity. However, he fails in that as well, cementing his damnation. He is a figure at once tragic and comical, trying to build his throne in a rotting kingdom, but he ruins that as well, by virtue of his incessant dronings on nothing. Thus, he fails in a third way, perhaps the most important of them all, and he is punished again, this time slipping backwards into oblivion. Slowly, quietly, making you wonder what was even the point. But the failure is not purely his. And in the end, none of this really matters. So, what did we learn? Nothing, probably. But if we were forced to extract a lesson, then it would go something like this. Be kind to others. You can't do everything on your own. Be honest with your feelings, and establish legitimate bonds that can help you through times of difficulty. Add your strength to theirs, and nothing can stand in your way. The alternative is to stand alone and be broken. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. Extraordinary men and women that can change the course of history on their own. But you probably aren't one of them, and if you incorrectly believe otherwise, then you will fail. That's the lesson of Dirk Strider. Learn from him.